Jack Sullivan always believed you could tell everything you needed to know about a person by watching how they treated the people who couldn't do anything for them. He'd spent nearly 40 years working construction, and that simple belief had never let him down. Some men measured success by the size of their house, others by the logo on the hood of their truck. Jack measured it by whether his crew wanted to keep working beside him. That Monday morning, the sun had barely cleared the rooftops of Ravenwood when Jack pulled his dusty pickup into the parking lot of the old Jefferson Community Center. The building had been standing since the early 1960s. Time hadn't been kind to it. The brick walls were stained. Several windows were boarded up, and the roof leaked every time it rained. In 3 months, though, it would become the heart of the neighborhood again. Jack climbed out of his truck, grabbed his hard hat, and smiled as the familiar sounds of a construction site filled the air. Power saws, air compressors, the steady rhythm of hammers. To most people, it sounded like noise. To Jack, it sounded like purpose. Morning, boss. Miguel Ramirez, one of the Glover carpenters, walked over carrying 2 coffees. I figured you'd forget breakfast again. Jack laughed. You know me too well. Miguel handed him one of the cups. My wife says if she ever meets you, she's going to start packing your lunch. Jack grinned. Tell her I'd appreciate it. Miguel shook his head. You laugh, but she'd actually do it. Jack took a sip. Strong. Exactly the way he liked it. You didn't have to buy this. I know. Miguel shrugged. You've covered enough lunches for me over the years. Jack waved the comment away. That's what people do. He never kept score. Never had. His father had raised him that way. If you're fortunate enough to help someone, his father used to say, then help them. Don't expect applause. Jack still heard those words nearly every day. He walked toward the building, stopping every few feet to greet workers by name. Not one, not two, every single one. The newest apprentice, the electrician, the crane operator, the cleanup crew. To Jack, titles didn't matter. People did. Morning, Mr. Sullivan. A nervous voice stopped him. A teenage apprentice named Tyler stood holding a stack of blueprints. He looked terrified. Jack smiled. You look like somebody told you the building's falling down. Tyler swallowed. I made a mistake yesterday. What kind? I ordered the wrong lumber. Jack nodded slowly. Okay. Tyler blinked. Okay, you already called the supplier. Yes, you fixed it. They're bringing the right shipment this afternoon. Jack smiled again. Then you didn't make a mistake. Tyler frowned. I did. No. Jack rested a hand on the young man's shoulder. You made an error. There's a difference. Tyler looked confused. A mistake is refusing to fix what went wrong. You fixed it. So today, Jack pointed toward the building. Today you build. Tyler's shoulders relaxed. Thank you. Jack chuckled. Someday you'll be explaining this to another nervous kid. As Tyler walked away looking 10 pounds lighter, Miguel shook his head. How do you do that? Do what? People leave your conversations believing they can conquer the world. Jack laughed. I don't. You do. Miguel looked around the site. Half this crew has worked with you for 20 years. Jack shrugged. I treat people the way I'd want somebody treating my sons. He stopped speaking for a moment. His sons. The words still caught in his throat sometimes. He and his wife, Linda, had dreamed of children. Life had different plans. Years of fertility treatments. Years of hope. Years of disappointment. Then cancer. The memories still lived quietly inside him. Not loud anymore. Just present. Linda had been gone nearly 6 years. The grief no longer knocked him to the ground. Instead, it walked beside him like an old companion. Some mornings he still reached for the other side of the bed before remembering. Other mornings, he smiled at something she would have laughed about. Love didn't disappear when someone died. It simply changed shape. Jack. He looked up. The city inspector was waving. We're ready for you. Jack tucked away the memories. Work first. Always work first. By late afternoon, the July heat had settled over Ravenwood like a heavy blanket. The workers gathered beneath a temporary shade canopy for lunch. Jack sat on an overturned bucket instead of the folding chairs. He'd always preferred it. It reminded him he was still one of the crew. Not above them, beside them. Miguel opened a cooler. "Anybody hungry?" The many laughed. "You ask that every day. And every day somebody answers yes." Before anyone could reach inside, a woman carrying 2 small children approached the fenced construction site. She looked embarrassed. Jack immediately stood. "Can I help you? I'm sorry to bother everyone." She held a folded letter. "My son plays basketball here." Jack smiled. "Well, he will again soon." The little boy looked at the building with wide eyes. "My coach said you're fixing it." "We're trying." The woman hesitated. "I heard," she looked uncomfortable, "that some of the workers volunteered their Saturday hours." Jack nodded. "A few of us. It means a lot." Her voice trembled slightly. "My husband passed away last year. I'm working 2 jobs. We couldn't afford to send him anywhere else." She looked toward the old gym. "This place is all these kids have." Jack didn't know what to say. "Sometimes I'm sorry," felt too small. Instead, he crouched so he was eye level with the little boy. "You play point guard?" The boy smiled. "How'd you know?" "Fast feet." The boy laughed. Jack reached into his truck. A brand new basketball sat behind the driver's seat. He'd bought it weeks ago. "Just because." He handed it to the boy. The child's eyes grew huge. "For me," Jack nodded. "You'll need something to practice with before the gym opens." The mother immediately shook her head. "We can't take that." "You can." "I can't pay. I wasn't selling it." The little boy hugged the basketball to his chest. His mother wiped away tears. "Thank you." After they left, one of the subcontractors walked over. "You buy those often?" Jack shrugged. "When they're on sale." "You planning ahead?" "No." Jack smiled softly. "I just like being ready." The subcontractor nodded thoughtfully. "You know," he looked toward the road, "that's probably why everybody likes working with you." Jack laughed. "I thought it was my charming personality. It definitely isn't that." The whole crew burst into laughter. Around 4 o'clock, Jack's phone buzzed. A reminder. Bennett Manufacturing Foundation Charity Gala. He stared at the screen for a moment. 3 weeks earlier, the foundation director had personally invited him. The company had donated a significant amount toward rebuilding the community center. Jack's crew had contributed hundreds of volunteer hours. The foundation wanted to recognize everyone involved. Jack almost declined. Galas weren't his world. He owned one suit. It fit mostly. But the foundation director had insisted. "People should know who's really rebuilding this city." Jack sighed. "Wes, I'm wearing the monkey suit." Miguel overheard him. "The fancy dinner." Jack nodded. "I'd rather stay here." "You have to go." "I know." Miguel grinned. "You clean up better than you think. Don't lie." "I'm not." Jack looked down at his dusty boots. "I'll be the only guy there whose hands have sawdust under the fingernails." Miguel smiled. "Maybe. But you'll also be the only one who earned those caluses." That evening, Jack stood in front of the mirror inside his modest home. The suit still fit. Barely. He adjusted his tie 3 different times before giving up. Linda had always tied it better. His eyes drifted toward a framed photograph resting on the dresser. It showed them standing on a beach 25 years earlier. She was laughing. He was pretending to look annoyed because she'd splashed water at him. He picked up the frame. "You would have loved making fun of this tie." Silence answered. Not painful silence. Just familiar silence. He smiled anyway. "I hope you'd be proud of me." He placed the photograph back exactly where it belonged. Then he grabbed his truck keys. The Bennett Grand Hotel ballroom looked like another world. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Live piano music drifted through the room. Waiters carried silver trays. Men wore custom-made tuxedos. Women wore elegant gowns. Jack suddenly felt very aware of his department store suit. A volunteer approached him. "Mr. Sullivan." He nodded. "We're so glad you came." She handed him a name badge. Several guests turned toward him. Some smiled warmly. Others looked him over with quiet curiosity. Construction foremen didn't usually attend events like this. Jack ignored the glances. People were people. Expensive clothes didn't change that. As he admired a display showing photographs of the community center renovation, he heard a calm voice beside him. "I've been hoping to meet the man behind those pictures." Jack turned. Standing beside him was a woman with kind blue eyes and silver, blonde hair elegantly pinned back. She wore a simple navy evening dress that somehow looked more graceful than the designer gowns around her. She smiled, not the practiced smile people used at charity events. A genuine one. "I'm Victoria Bennett." Jack recognized the name immediately. CEO, widow, one of Ravenwood's most respected business leaders. He extended his hand. "Jack Sullivan." "I know." She glanced toward the photographs. "I've heard wonderful things about you." Jack chuckled. "I hope not all from Miguel." She laughed. "I don't know Miguel." "You probably should. He talks enough for 3 people." Victoria smiled wider. "I already like him." Jack found himself smiling back. It surprised him how easy the conversation felt. No awkwardness, no pretending. Just 2 people talking. Across the ballroom, another pair of eyes watched them. Olivia Bennett stood beside the champagne fountain, her expression slowly hardening. She looked from Jack's worn hands to the way her mother was laughing, then back again. Her jaw tightened. She didn't know Jack Sullivan. She didn't know anything about him. But one thought settled firmly into her mind. He doesn't belong in her world. And before the night was over, she intended to make sure everyone else believed it too. If you're enjoying this story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There are many more heartfelt stories like this one waiting for you. Now, let's see what happens when 2 very different worlds begin to collide. Jack had attended enough public events over the years to know when he was out of place. The Bennett Grand Hotel ballroom confirmed it. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors. Conversations drifted between business deals and vacation homes. Waiters glided silently through the crowd with silver trays balanced effortlessly on one hand. Jack accepted a glass of sparkling water from one of them. He'd never been much of a champagne man. As far as he was concerned, water tasted just fine after a long day's work. He wandered toward one of the photo displays featuring the Jefferson Community Center renovation. Large before and after renderings lined the wall, showing the building's transformation from a neglected shell into something the neighborhood could once again be proud of. He barely noticed Victoria Bennett stepping beside him until she spoke. "You've been studying those pictures longer than anyone else." Jack smiled. "I'm checking to make sure they didn't accidentally use someone else's work." She laughed softly. "I've seen enough progress reports to know they didn't." For a few moments they stood quietly looking at the photographs. "It means something to you," Victoria said. Jack nodded. "When I was a kid, places like this kept a lot of us out of trouble." "You grew up here, just across town." He pointed toward one of the photographs. "My dad taught me to play basketball in that gym." Victoria looked surprised. "So this project is personal." "I guess it is." She folded her arms comfortably. "My father started Bennett Manufacturing in a garage." Jack looked at her. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't. They just see the company today." Her eyes drifted toward the ballroom. "They don't remember there were years when my parents weren't sure they'd make payroll." Jack smiled. "Funny how success erases history." "It does." Neither of them noticed that their conversation had already lasted nearly 20 minutes. Most introductions at events like these were measured in seconds. This one felt easy. "So," Victoria asked, "how long have you been in construction?" Jack chuckled. "Long enough that my knees remind me every morning." She laughed. "I was hoping for years." 41. "That's impressive. I've never wanted to do anything else." "You've never considered retiring?" He shook his head immediately. "What would I do?" "Travel. I've seen enough hotels. Hobbies. I build things." She smiled. "I suppose that answers the question." Jack looked toward her. "What about you?" She gave a small sigh. "I've been CEO for 5 years. Since your husband passed." He hadn't meant it as a question. Her expression softened. "You know, the newspaper covered it. It was difficult. I imagine." She looked down at the floor for a moment. Some days it still is. Jack understood that look perfectly. My wife passed away 6 years ago. Victoria turned toward him. I'm sorry. So am I. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood something words couldn't explain. Victoria finally asked quietly, what was her name? Linda. You. David. Jack nodded. Were you married long? 30? 3 years. He smiled gently. Linda and I had 32. Victoria looked away toward the windows overlooking downtown Ravenwood. People assume grief has an expiration date. Jack nodded. They ask if you've moved on. I never liked that expression. Neither did I. Victoria smiled sadly. You don't move on. You move forward. Jack looked at her. I've said almost those exact words. Their eyes met. For the first time that evening, neither of them looked away immediately. Across the ballroom, Olivia noticed. She quietly excused herself from a conversation with 2 board members. Instead of approaching them, she walked toward Greg Lawson. The company's longtime chief financial officer stood near the bar speaking with several executives. Greg followed Olivia's gaze. I see your mother found someone interesting. Olivia frowned. Do you know him? I know who he is. Construction foreman. Greg took a sip of his drink. Seems harmless enough. Olivia didn't answer. Greg watched Jack for another moment. Then he smiled. Not warmly. Calculatingly. Interesting. An hour later, guests gathered inside the ballroom for dinner. Jack found his name card. Table 12. Victoria looked at hers. Table 7. She frowned. I suppose that's one downside of being the CEO. Jack laughed. They're keeping us separated. It seems that way. She hesitated. Would you have coffee me sometime? Jack blinked. Coffee? I've spent enough years attending expensive dinners. She smiled. I'd rather have a conversation. Jack couldn't help smiling. I know a diner. Victoria laughed. I was thinking somewhere slightly quieter. I suppose that works too. She reached into her evening bag and handed him a business card. My direct number. Jack accepted it carefully. I'll call. I hope you do. Before either of them could say anything else, the master of ceremonies asked everyone to take their seats. Victoria returned to the head table. Jack walked toward the back of the ballroom. Neither of them noticed Olivia watching every step. The following afternoon, Jack stared at Victoria's business card while sitting in his pickup during lunch. Miguel leaned through the driver's window. You've been looking at that card for 10 minutes. Jack slipped it into his shirt pocket. I have not. You have? Miguel grinned. So what? You gonna call? Jack sighed. I don't know. Why? He looked out across the construction site. Our worlds aren't exactly the same. Miguel laughed. You build buildings. She runs companies. Somebody has to build the buildings. Jack smiled. You make everything sound simple. It usually is. Miguel shrugged. People complicate it. Jack thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Finally, just before 6, he dialed the number. Victoria answered on the second ring. Hello, hi, a brief pause. Jack, you recognized my voice. I hoped it would be you. He smiled without realizing it. I was wondering if that coffee invitation still stands. It does. When are you free? Tomorrow morning. Jack laughed. You're the CEO. I know. I make my own schedule. The next morning Jack parked outside a small independent coffee shop overlooking Ravenwood Lake. He had expected Victoria to choose one of the city's luxury cafes. Instead she stepped out of her SUV wearing blue jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. No security, no assistant, no designer handbag, just Victoria. You picked this place? Jack asked. She smiled. I come here almost every Saturday. You do. They make excellent blueberry muffins. Jack laughed. That's a pretty convincing business strategy. Inside, they ordered ordinary coffee. No elaborate drinks. No ceremony. They chose a table near the window overlooking the water. For nearly 2 hours they talked. Not about money. Not about business. Not about status. They talked about favorite books, old movies, the first cars they ever owned, the music they still listened to. Jack admitted he still kept Linda's old record player because he couldn't bear to throw it away. Victoria confessed she still couldn't remove David's reading chair from the living room. It feels wrong, she admitted. Jack nodded. I understand. They shared stories about marriages that hadn't been perfect. Arguments over paint colors. Burned dinners. Forgotten anniversaries. The little things people remembered long after someone was gone. By the time they stood to leave, neither had looked at their phone once. Victoria smiled. I can't remember the last time 2 hours disappeared that quickly. Jack admitted quietly. Neither can I. They walked outside together. A cool breeze moved across the lake. Victoria looked at him. I'd like to see you again. Jack smiled. I'd like that too. Neither noticed a familiar luxury SUV parked across the street. Inside sat Olivia. She lowered the camera she'd been using. Several photographs filled the screen. Jack, Victoria. Laughing. Smiling. Looking happier than Olivia had seen her mother in years. Instead of feeling relieved, her stomach tightened. She whispered to herself, I don't know what you want from my mother, but I'm going to find out. She started the engine. For the first time since losing her father, Olivia Bennet had chosen someone to distrust, and she intended to prove she was right. By Monday morning, Jack had almost convinced himself the coffee with Victoria Bennet had been nothing more than two lonely people sharing a pleasant conversation. Almost. He climbed out of his pickup just before sunrise and was greeted by the familiar chorus of power tools coming to life across the Jefferson Community Center construction site. It felt good to be back where everything made sense. Concrete either cured properly or it didn't. A wall was either level or it wasn't. People worked together, solved problems, and went home tired. Life was simpler when you built things. Morning, boss. Miguel waved from the temporary office trailer. You look suspiciously cheerful. Jack chuckled. I had coffee. With the CEO. Jack shot him a look. I never said who it was with. You didn't have to. Miguel grinned. Half the crew watched you leave that gala looking like a high school kid after his first date. Several workers nearby laughed. Jack shook his head. I hate all of you. No, you don't. No, he smiled. I really don't. As everyone returned to work, Jack walked through the site checking measurements and answering questions. To the crew, nothing had changed. He was still the same foreman who showed up before everyone else and stayed after everyone had gone home. If anything, he seemed lighter, less burdened. It had been a long time since anyone had made him laugh the way Victoria had. Across town, Bennet Manufacturing's headquarters buzzed with the usual Monday morning activity. The company's headquarters overlooked Ravenwood from 12 stories above the city. Victoria stepped out of the elevator carrying a travel mug instead of her usual briefcase. Her executive assistant, Karen, immediately noticed. Good morning. It is. Karen smiled. Something tells me you had a nice weekend. Victoria laughed softly. Was I that obvious? A little. Karen followed her into the office. You've smiled 3 times in the last minute. Have I? You have. Victoria looked out the floor to ceiling windows toward the city. I had coffee with someone. Karen raised an eyebrow. The construction foreman. Victoria turned. How did you know? Karen tried not to laugh. The board noticed you talking for almost an hour at the gala. So people are already talking. Karen hesitated. A little. Victoria sighed. I suppose they would. Karen chose her next words carefully. I don't think they're talking because he's a bad man. No. They're talking because no one expected the CEO of Bennet Manufacturing to enjoy spending time with someone ordinary. Victoria frowned. Ordinary. Karen immediately regretted the word. I didn't mean. I know what you meant. Victoria looked back out the window. The funny thing is, she smiled to herself. He never once asked about the company. Karen looked surprised. Really? He asked about my favorite book. Karen blinked, and he listened. There was another brief silence. Finally Karen smiled. That sounds refreshing. It was. Elsewhere in the building, Greg Lawson sat inside the executive conference room reviewing quarterly reports. A knock interrupted him. Olivia Bennett stepped inside. You wanted to see me? Greg closed the folder. I wanted to check on your mother. Olivia folded her arms. Why? I noticed she seemed distracted. Olivia hesitated. She met someone? I heard. Greg leaned back comfortably. The construction foreman. Olivia nodded. I don't like it. Greg didn't answer immediately. Instead, he allowed several seconds of silence to pass. Sometimes people filled silence by saying exactly what they were thinking. Olivia did. My mother isn't thinking clearly. Greg looked thoughtful. Grief can make people vulnerable. I know. They want companionship. I know. They stop asking difficult questions. Olivia sighed. I just don't want someone taking advantage of her. Greg nodded slowly. Neither do I. It sounded sincere. It wasn't. Because Greg wasn't worried about Jack Sullivan. He was worried about Victoria. A happy Victoria was harder to manipulate. For months he'd been quietly preparing several board members for what he believed would eventually become a transition in leadership. Victoria was respected, but she had also become cautious. Too cautious. She rejected risky acquisitions. She refused questionable accounting practices. She insisted every employee, from janitor to vice president, receive the same health benefits. Greg called it inefficient. The employees called it loyalty. Now another complication had appeared. Jack Sullivan. Greg had spent decades learning how power worked. He knew one undeniable truth. People in love became unpredictable, and unpredictability threatened plans. Very expensive plans. Wednesday afternoon. Jack's phone rang while he was reviewing blueprints. Jack speaking. Hello. He smiled immediately. Hi, Victoria. I hope I'm not interrupting. You caught me before the concrete inspection. I'll be quick. I was wondering. She hesitated. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow? Jack looked around the noisy construction site. I should warn you. I'm not exactly a fancy restaurant kind of guy. I wasn't planning on one. You weren't. I found a little Italian place near the river. Jack laughed. I've actually eaten there. Good. I won't embarrass myself trying to pronounce French menu items. Victoria laughed. I appreciate that. So, tomorrow. I'll be there. After hanging up, Jack caught himself smiling again. Miguel walked by carrying lumber. There it is again. What? That smile. Jack shook his head. Go back to work. I am working. Miguel winked. I'm supervising your love life. That evening, Victoria sat alone in her dining room looking at an old family photograph. David stood beside her. Ethan was 25. Olivia was 18. It had been taken during Ethan's graduate school celebration. Everyone looked happy. She traced David's smiling face with one finger. I miss you. She hadn't stopped saying those words. She wasn't sure she ever would. Then she looked at another framed photograph. It showed her and Jack standing near the community center during the charity gala. Someone from the foundation had emailed it earlier that day. Neither of them was looking at the camera. They were laughing. Real laughter. She hadn't seen herself laugh like that in years. For the first time since David died, she didn't feel guilty for smiling. She felt grateful. Unfortunately, she wasn't the only one looking at photographs. Across town, Olivia sat at her apartment dining table with a laptop open. The photographs she'd taken outside the coffee shop filled the screen. Jack opening Victoria's car door. Jack smiling. Jack laughing. Jack walking beside her mother. Olivia zoomed in repeatedly. Searching. Looking for something. Anything. There wasn't much to see. No expensive watch. No flashy clothes. No signs of wealth. No signs of deception. That bothered her more than finding evidence would have. People who wanted something usually looked the part. Jack didn't, which made him harder to understand. Her phone buzzed. Greg, any luck? No. Keep looking. I will. Greg paused. Sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who look harmless. After ending the call, Olivia stared at Jack's photograph one last time. She whispered quietly, I'll figure you out. I have to. The following morning, inside Bennett Manufacturing, whispers began spreading between departments. Did you hear? The CEO is seeing someone. I heard he's a contractor. No, a construction foreman. Seriously? I wonder what that's about. Maybe he's remodeling her house? Maybe. But they looked pretty close at the gala. Rumors rarely needed facts. They only needed curiosity. By lunchtime, nearly every executive floor had heard some version of the story. By the end of the day, several members of the board had heard it too. One elderly director leaned back in his chair after the meeting. A construction foreman. Another frowned. I hope she's being careful. Greg remained silent. He didn't have to start the rumors anymore. They had begun walking on their own. And once rumors found momentum, they were almost impossible to stop. Far across the city, Jack finished another day, helping rebuild a community center. He had no idea another kind of construction had already begun. Someone was quietly building a case against him. Brick by brick. Lie by lie. Jack Sullivan had never cared much about what strangers thought of him. He'd learned long ago that if you spent your life trying to satisfy everyone, you'd eventually disappoint yourself. Still, he couldn't deny he looked forward to Thursday evening. For the first time in years, he found himself checking the clock. At exactly 6, he parked outside Romano's Italian restaurant overlooking the Raven River. The restaurant wasn't fancy, it wasn't cheap either, it was warm, quiet. The kind of place where people actually talked instead of staring at their phones. Victoria was already waiting outside. She wore a light blue blouse beneath a cream-colored cardigan and dark slacks. There wasn't a single piece of flashy jewelry on her, except a simple gold wedding band hanging from a delicate chain around her neck. Jack noticed it immediately. She caught him looking. I can't bring myself to put it away. Jack nodded. You don't have to. She smiled gratefully. You understand? I do. Without another word, he offered his arm to help her over the uneven brick walkway. She accepted it naturally. Neither of them noticed a black SUV parked across the street. Inside sat Olivia. She lowered a pair of binoculars. So it wasn't just coffee. She picked up her phone. I found them. Dinner lasted nearly 2 hours. Neither of them noticed the time. Victoria laughed more than she had in months. Jack discovered she loved old Western movies. She discovered he secretly enjoyed baking apple pies, though he admitted they usually looked better than they tasted. You bake? Jack shrugged. Linda handled most of the cooking. She got sick. His voice softened. I had to learn. Were you any good? The smoke detector got a workout. Victoria laughed so hard she nearly spilled her iced tea. I would have paid to see that. I would have paid someone to stop me. Their laughter drew smiles from nearby diners, not because they were loud, because it sounded genuine. Eventually Victoria became thoughtful. Can I ask you something? Anything? Have you ever thought about dating before now? Jack took his time answering. There were opportunities. But I wasn't ready. She nodded. I understand. I think. He searched for the right words. I spent years trying to figure out whether moving forward meant leaving Linda behind. Victoria looked at him quietly. And I finally realized loving someone new doesn't erase loving someone you lost. She smiled. I've been struggling with the same thing. For several moments neither spoke. Jack finally reached across the table. Not dramatically. Not romantically. Simply placing his hand over hers. I don't think they'd want us to spend the rest of our lives lonely. Victoria's eyes shimmered. No. I don't think they would. Across town, Olivia sat inside a private investigator's office. The investigator, Frank Dawson, had spent nearly 30 years tracking missing persons, insurance fraud, and dishonest spouses. He reviewed the photographs Olivia had brought. What exactly would you like me to find? Everything. He looked up. Everything. I want to know who Jack Sullivan really is. Frank nodded. Any particular reason? My mother is seeing him. I see. I think he's after her money. Frank remained professional. Do you have any evidence? No. Has he asked her for money? Not that I know of. As he lied about his background. I don't know. Frank folded his hands. Miss Bennett. I'll investigate anyone you hire me to investigate. But I should tell you something. What? In my experience, the people who are trying to hide something usually give me a reason to start digging. Olivia frowned. What does that mean? It means I'm happy to do the work. But so far, you've described a man who's had dinner with your mother. She crossed her arms. You don't understand. No, I probably don't. But I'll find the facts. Not assumptions. Olivia nodded. That's all I'm asking. The following week, Jack and Victoria settled into an easy routine. One evening they walked through Ravenwood Botanical Gardens. Another afternoon they visited a local farmer's market. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they simply enjoyed walking together. Neither felt the need to impress the other. It was comfortable. Jack had forgotten relationships could feel this peaceful. Victoria had forgotten what it felt like to laugh without forcing herself. One Saturday morning they found themselves sitting on a bench overlooking Ravenwood Lake. A young couple nearby struggled to keep their toddler from chasing ducks. The little girl finally escaped. She ran straight toward the water. Before either parent reacted, Jack calmly stepped in, scooping her up just before she reached the shoreline. There you go, little explorer. The little girl giggled. Her exhausted parents hurried over. Thank you so much. No problem. The father smiled. You're good with kids. Jack's expression softened. I like to think I would have been. The words slipped out before he could stop them. The young parents exchanged an apologetic glance. We're sorry. Jack simply smiled. It's all right. After they walked away, Victoria looked at him gently. You wanted children. He nodded. We tried? For years. He stared across the lake. It never happened. Victoria reached for his hand. I'm sorry. So was Linda. He smiled sadly. She blamed herself. But it was never anyone's fault. Victoria squeezed his hand. For several quiet moments they simply sat together. No advice, no speeches, just understanding. Meanwhile, Frank Dawson continued his investigation. He pulled employment records, tax filings, property records, court documents, military records, driving history, former employers, former neighbors, former coworkers. Everything matched. Jack Sullivan had worked honestly his entire adult life. No arrests, no lawsuits, no unpaid taxes, no bankruptcies, no suspicious financial activity. Frank interviewed several people who had known Jack for decades. Every conversation sounded almost identical. Best foreman I ever worked with. He helped my family after my husband died. He paid for my son's trade school. He never told anyone. He coached Little League for years. He rebuilt my porch after the tornado. He wouldn't even let me pay him. Frank leaned back in his chair. That was unusual. After 3 decades in private investigations, he'd learned one uncomfortable truth. Nobody was perfect. Everybody had something. Yet somehow, Jack Sullivan appeared remarkably ordinary and remarkably decent. Frank finally called Olivia. I've finished the preliminary investigation. What did you find? A good man. Silence. What? I found a hard-working construction foreman. No hidden companies. No secret accounts. No criminal record. No gambling. No affairs. No major debts. No evidence he's pursuing your mother for financial reasons. Olivia frowned. You must have missed something. I don't think I did. You only looked for a week. I've been doing this for 30 years. I know when someone is hiding something. And I don't believe Jack Sullivan is. Olivia stared out the window. There has to be something. The Frank sighed. I can keep investigating. But I think you're looking for proof instead of truth. She ended the call without answering. That evening, Olivia drove past the Jefferson Community Center. She watched from across the street as the construction crew finished another long day. One by one the workers climbed into their trucks. Before leaving, Jack walked back across the site. He picked up discarded lumber, straightened safety barriers, helped a young apprentice load tools into his truck. None of it looked staged. No cameras. No audience. Just habit. Then something unexpected happened. A homeless veteran pushing a shopping cart stopped outside the construction fence. Jack walked over. The 2 men spoke briefly. Jack disappeared into the trailer. He returned carrying 2 boxed dinners left over from the crew's lunch. He handed them over. The veteran tried to refuse. Jack insisted. The older man finally accepted. Before leaving, Jack shook his hand. Not quickly. Not awkwardly. Like an equal. Olivia watched the entire exchange through her windshield. It unsettled her. People pretending to be kind usually made sure someone important was watching. Jack had no idea she was there. He simply climbed into his dusty pickup and drove away. Olivia remained parked for several more minutes. Her certainty had begun to crack. Only slightly, but enough to make her uncomfortable. As she started her engine, she whispered to herself, "If he's not after her money then why is he here?" She still couldn't answer the question. Unfortunately, someone else already had. High above Ravenwood, inside his corner office, Greg Lawson closed a folder marked Board Strategy. He looked at a photograph of Jack that had been quietly placed on his desk earlier that afternoon. Greg smiled. So, the investigator found nothing. He wasn't disappointed. He had never expected Jack to make this easy. If facts couldn't destroy the relationship, then rumors would. And Greg Lawson had spent an entire career learning that rumors were often far more powerful than the truth. 3 weeks later, the Jefferson Community Center looked nothing like the abandoned building Jack Sullivan had first walked into. Fresh brickwork replaced crumbling walls. New windows reflected the morning sun. The roof no longer leaked. Inside, volunteers painted classrooms while electricians finished installing lights in the gymnasium. Jack stood in the middle of the basketball court, studying the ceiling. Miguel walked over carrying a clipboard. "You know," he said, "normal people celebrate finishing a project. We're not finished. We're 95% finished. 95 isn't 100. Miguel laughed. "I swear you're impossible." Jack smiled. "My father used to say the last 5% is what people remember. So that's why you keep making us redo things." "I make you redo crooked things." Miguel looked up at the ceiling. "I still think nobody would have noticed." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You would have?" Miguel sighed dramatically. "Yeah, I would have." Jack clapped him on the shoulder. "And that's why you're becoming a good carpenter." Before Miguel could answer, Jack's phone buzzed. Victoria. He smiled before answering. "Good morning. I was hoping you weren't standing on a roof. Just a basketball court." "That's slightly better." Jack chuckled. "Everything all right? I wanted to remind you about tonight. The foundation gala?" "You remembered?" "I wrote it on my calendar." Victoria laughed. "I wasn't sure whether construction foremen used calendars." "We do. They usually have sawdust on them." "I'll consider myself warned." She hesitated. "I should tell you something." Jack noticed the change in her voice. "What is it?" "My daughter will be there." I assumed she would. She still hasn't warmed to the idea of us. Jack leaned against a newly painted wall. "She's protecting you." "I know. I'm not angry." Victoria sighed softly. "I just don't want tonight to become uncomfortable." Jack answered without hesitation. "If she has concerns, she has every right to ask them." Victoria smiled sadly. "You really are impossible." "So I've been told." "I'll see you tonight. I'll be there." After ending the call, Jack slipped the phone into his pocket. Miguel looked over. "You've got that smile again." Jack shook his head. "I've got work." "You've got both." "You across town." Preparations for the Bennett Manufacturing Foundation Gala were already underway. The event had become one of Ravenwood's biggest annual fundraisers. Community leaders, business owners, local politicians, charity directors, nearly everyone who mattered would be attending. Victoria stood inside the ballroom, reviewing the seating arrangements with Karen. "Move the Jefferson Community Center volunteers closer to the stage." Karen nodded. "They earned it." "What about the board members? They'll survive sitting one table farther away." Karen smiled. "I thought you might say that." Victoria looked toward the stage. "This event isn't about executives. It's about people who actually change the community." Karen looked at her thoughtfully. "Jack has changed more than the community." Victoria looked down at the seating chart. "I know." Before Karen could say anything else, Olivia entered the ballroom. She looked elegant in a dark emerald evening gown, but her expression remained guarded. "Mom." Victoria smiled. "You look beautiful." Thanks. Olivia glanced at the seating chart. Is he coming? Victoria didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. Olivia looked away. I wish he wasn't. Victoria took a slow breath. Olivia, I've been patient. I've been polite. But I still don't trust him. You barely know him. I know enough. Victoria gently placed a hand on her daughter's arm. No. You've decided enough. Olivia's jaw tightened. They're the same thing. Victoria quietly removed her hand. No, they aren't. That evening, Jack stood once again in front of the same bedroom mirror. He adjusted his tie. It still looked crooked. Linda would have fixed it in 3 seconds. He smiled at her photograph. I still can't tie these things. He laughed quietly to himself. I guess some lessons only worked because you were around. For a moment he simply stood there. Then he picked up his truck keys. You would have liked Victoria. The room remained silent. Yet somehow, saying the words out loud made him feel lighter. The ballroom buzzed with conversation. Hundreds of guests filled the room. As Jack entered, several volunteers from the community center waved enthusiastically. Jack! There he is! You finally cleaned up. Jack laughed as several construction workers surrounded him. One of the volunteers jokingly adjusted his tie. Still crooked. I know. It gives you character. Across the room, Victoria noticed him immediately. Her smile appeared before she even realized it. She crossed the ballroom. I'm glad you came. I said I would. She looked him over. You clean up nicely. Jack looked down at himself. I feel like I'm wearing someone else's clothes. Victoria laughed. You'll survive. For the next hour they spoke with donors, volunteers, and city officials. Jack never tried to impress anyone. When donors praised the project, he redirected every compliment toward his crew. When reporters asked for interviews, he insisted they photograph the apprentices instead. The future's standing behind me, he told one photographer. They're the story. Several guests quietly noticed, including numbers at the Bennett Manufacturing Board. One elderly director leaned toward another. He seems genuine. His colleague nodded. I wasn't expecting that. Neither noticed Greg Lawson listening nearby. Greg's polite smile never reached his eyes. Diener concluded with the foundation presenting awards for community service. The MC stepped onto the stage. This year's Community Builder Award goes to a man who reminds us that leadership isn't measured by titles. Please welcome Jack Sullivan. Applause filled the ballroom. Construction workers cheered louder than anyone. Jack looked genuinely surprised. He glanced toward Victoria. She smiled and nodded. He slowly walked to the stage. The applause continued. Jack accepted the crystal plaque awkwardly. He leaned toward the microphone. I wasn't expecting this. A few people laughed. I'm not much of a speech maker. Most of what we've accomplished wasn't because of me. He pointed toward the tables where his crew sat. Those men and women rebuilt a building most people had forgotten. They showed up early. They stayed late. They volunteered weekends. They missed birthdays. They missed football games. They deserve this. The audience applauded again. Jack smiled. I've spent my whole life believing something simple. If you're lucky enough to have 2 strong hands, you should use them to leave the world a little better than you found it. Thank you. The ballroom rose to its feet. Even people who had never met him found themselves applauding. Victoria wiped away a small tear. She couldn't remember the last speech that felt so honest. Greg noticed the standing ovation. His smile disappeared. This was becoming a problem. As guests mingled after dinner, Olivia watched people surround Jack. Board members laughed with him. City officials shook his hand. Employees asked for photographs. Even people she'd known for years seemed drawn to him. It didn't make sense. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't famous. Yet somehow, people genuinely liked him. Greg quietly stepped beside her. You look concerned. They're all falling for him. Greg kept his voice calm. Appearances can be convincing. Olivia folded her arms. I need people to see what I see. Greg looked across the ballroom. Then perhaps you should ask him a question. What kind of question? One that everyone wants answered. Olivia looked toward her mother. Victoria was smiling at Jack, really smiling. For the first time in years, Olivia's stomach tightened. She loved her mother. She loved her enough to risk making a scene. If she embarrassed herself, so be it. If she embarrassed Jack, even better. She took a deep breath and began walking across the ballroom. Conversation slowly quieted as guests noticed the CEO's daughter approaching. Victoria immediately sensed something was wrong. Olivia, her daughter, stopped only a few feet away. She looked directly at Jack. Her voice was clear enough for dozens of nearby guests to hear. "Can I ask you something?" Jack nodded calmly. "Of course." Olivia took another step forward. "You've spent your whole life working construction." "Yes. My mother runs a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars." The conversations around them stopped completely. Jack remained silent. Olivia looked him directly in the eyes. "So tell everyone. What exactly do you have to offer a woman like her?" The ballroom fell silent. Every eye turned toward Jack. Victoria's face drained of color. Greg watched from across the room, waiting, smiling to himself, because the first public attack had finally begun. The silence inside the ballroom felt heavier than the music that had filled it only moments before. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on Jack Sullivan. No one reached for a drink. No one whispered. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Victoria stared at her daughter in disbelief. "Olivia." But Olivia never took her eyes off Jack. "What do you have to offer her?" She repeated the question more slowly. "My mother could have anyone. Successful executives, doctors, attorneys, business owners. So why should she choose you?" Victoria stepped forward. "That's enough." Jack gently raised one hand. "It's all right." He looked at Victoria first, then back at Olivia. His expression never changed. There was no anger, no embarrassment, only quiet patience. "I think that's a fair question." Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Olivia clearly hadn't expected that answer. Jack smiled politely. "The problem is, I don't think I'm the right person to answer it." She frowned. "Why not?" "Because relationships aren't job interviews." A few people nearby nodded almost instinctively. Jack continued calmly. "I've never asked your mother to choose me. I've never asked her for anything. I've simply enjoyed spending time with her." Olivia folded her arms. "That's not an answer." "It is. You just don't like it." The room remained silent. Jack spoke softly enough that everyone leaned in to hear him. "I can't compete with executives. I can't compete with millionaires. I've never wanted to. I've worked with my hands my entire life. They're rough. They ache when it rains. I don't own expensive watches. I don't belong to country clubs. I still drive the same pickup I've had for 12 years. He smiled faintly. "And I still think coffee tastes better in a diner than it does in a 5-star hotel." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. Even a few board members smiled. Olivia didn't. "So you admit you're not in her world?" Jack nodded. "I've never pretended otherwise." Victoria looked at him with admiration. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to win. He was simply telling the truth. Olivia took another step closer. "Then why are you here?" Jack answered immediately. "Because your mother invited me." Another silence settled over the ballroom. Simple, honest, impossible to argue with. Olivia felt herself losing control of the conversation. She looked toward the crowd. "Doesn't anyone else think this is strange?" No one answered. Finally, one elderly woman stood from a nearby table. Jack recognized her immediately. Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She had volunteered at the community center for nearly 20 years. "I'd like to say something." The ballroom turned toward her. Mrs. Carter smiled warmly. "Mr. Sullivan rebuilt the wheelchair ramp at my house after my husband passed away. I offered to pay him. He refused." She looked around the room. "He told me neighbors don't send invoices." She sat down. Before anyone could speak, another voice came from across the ballroom. "I've got one." A firefighter stood. 5 years ago, our station roof collapsed after a storm. Jack and his crew spent an entire weekend helping us repair it. He wouldn't accept $1. Then another voice. "He coached my grandson's baseball team." Another. He built the playground behind our church. Another. He repaired my mother's porch. One after another, stories filled the ballroom. Not grand gestures. Not headlines. Small acts of kindness. Years of them. Jack looked genuinely uncomfortable. He quietly rubbed the back of his neck. You really don't have to. Mrs. Carter interrupted. Yes. We do. You've spent your whole life helping everyone else. It's about time somebody helped you. Victoria felt tears forming. She looked toward Jack. He looked as though he wished the floor would open beneath him. Recognition embarrassed him. That told her everything. People chasing admiration usually enjoyed moments like this. Jack clearly didn't. Olivia looked around the room in disbelief. She hadn't known about any of these stories. Not one. Greg watched from the back of the ballroom. His jaw tightened. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to unfold. He quietly slipped away before anyone noticed. An hour later the gala slowly came to an end. Guests gathered their coats while conversations drifted back to normal. Victoria found Jack standing alone on the hotel terrace overlooking downtown Ravenwood. The evening air carried the smell of summer rain. I'm sorry. Jack looked over. For what? My daughter. He shook his head. Don't be. She humiliated you. No. He smiled gently. She asked a question. Victoria folded her arms. In front of 300 people. She's trying to protect someone she loves. I understand that. Victoria sighed. Most people would have walked out. I thought about it. You did. For about 3 seconds. She laughed despite herself. What changed your mind? Jack looked across the city lights. I figured leaving would have embarrassed you. And I wasn't willing to do that. Victoria stared at him. You always think about everyone else first. Not always. Almost always. He smiled. It's a bad habit. No. She stepped closer. It's one of your best qualities. They stood quietly beside one another. Neither spoke for nearly a minute. Finally Victoria asked, Can I tell you something? Of course. I haven't been this happy in years. Jack looked down. I was afraid to admit that. Why? Because it felt like I was betraying Linda. Victoria nodded slowly. I know. I felt the same way about David. She reached into her purse and removed the chain she always wore around her neck. The wedding band rested against her palm. I've carried this every day for 5 years. Jack remained silent. I thought taking it off my hand meant I was forgetting him. Her voice trembled slightly. But tonight, she smiled through watery eyes. I realized I'm not letting go of my past. I'm allowing myself a future. Jack looked at the ring, then at her. You don't have to rush anything. I'm not. She slipped the chain back beneath her blouse. I'm simply telling you how I feel. Jack's smile was quiet. So am I. Across town, Olivia drove home alone. She replayed the evening again and again. She had expected Jack to become angry, to defend himself, to lose his temper. Instead, everyone else had defended him. She hated how confused she felt. When she reached her apartment, Ethan was waiting outside. He had attended the gala but left early after a client called. I heard what happened. Olivia unlocked the door. Then you know Mom's making a mistake. Ethan followed her inside. You saw everyone. I did. They've all been fooled. Ethan leaned against the kitchen counter. Liv. When was the last time you heard 300 people tell the same lie? She frowned. They don't know him. Neither do you. I know enough. You've decided enough? She glared at him. Whose side are you on? Ethan's side? I'm on Mom's. So am I. No. He shook his head. You're trying to protect her. I'm trying to let her be happy. They aren't the same thing. Olivia looked away. Her voice softened. I can't lose her too. Ethan's expression changed immediately. He walked over and hugged his younger sister. You aren't going to. I already lost Dad. I know. What if this man hurts her? Ethan answered honestly. I don't think he will. How can you be sure? I can't. I know one thing. What? I've never seen Mom smile like that since Dad died. Olivia closed her eyes. She remembered that smile. It bothered her because it looked real. And if it was real, then everything she believed about Jack might be wrong. The next morning, Greg Lawson arrived at his office before anyone else. He opened a locked drawer. Inside sat several confidential company files. He removed one folder and placed it on his desk. Its cover was blank. No labels, no company logo, only one photograph clipped to the front, Jack Sullivan. Greg stared at it for several seconds. "You survived the first attack." He smiled coldly. "That's all right. I've never relied on just one." He picked up the phone. "I need a favor." The voice on the other end answered. "What kind?" Greg looked once more at Jack's photograph. "I need someone to dig deeper. There has to be something in his past. And if there isn't..." His smile widened. "We'll simply give people something to find." The first rumors reached Bennett Manufacturing before 8 o'clock Monday morning. Not through official emails. Not through board meetings. Through whispered conversations in hallways. "I heard the CEO's boyfriend has financial problems." "Rarely." That's what someone in accounting said. "I thought he was just a construction foreman." Apparently he's buried in debt. Nobody knew where the story had started. Nobody questioned it. Rumors had a way of sounding believable simply because they were repeated often enough. Jack was completely unaware. He was standing on the roof of the Jefferson Community Center, inspecting the final section of flashing before the afternoon rain arrived. Miguel climbed the ladder carrying a tool bag. "You know what today's supposed to be?" "Monday." "I was thinking payday." Jack laughed. "I like my answer better." Miguel handed him a drill. "You've been distracted lately." "I've been busy." "Nook." "You've been smiling." Jack rolled his eyes. "I'm 59. "Exactly. You should know better." The two men laughed as they returned to work. A few minutes later Tyler called from below. "Jack!" "What is it?" "The city inspector's here." "I'll be down." Jack carefully climbed the ladder. As he reached the ground, the inspector extended a hand. "I've got good news." Jack smiled. "I always like good news." The building passed every inspection. A cheer erupted from the crew. Miguel threw both hands into the air. "I told you we'd do it." Jack looked around at the workers. "No. We did it." The crew gathered together for a group photograph. Jack quietly slipped toward the back. The photographer noticed. "No, Jack? Front row. This one's about the crew. And you're part of it." Jack reluctantly stepped forward. The flash captured dozens of smiling faces. A building restored. A neighborhood renewed. None of them realized another kind of construction was happening across town. One built with lies instead of lumber. Inside Bennett Manufacturing, Greg Lawson closed the door to his office. Across from him sat a man in an expensive gray suit. His name was Randall Pierce. He owned a small consulting firm that specialized in what he politely called reputation research. Greg called it something else. Insurance. Randall opened a notebook. "So, you need information on Jack Sullivan?" "I need something." Randall nodded. "My preliminary search didn't uncover much." "I know. That's the problem." Greg leaned back. "People trust clean records. They shouldn't." Randall folded his hands. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Greg chose his words carefully. "Look harder." "I already have." "There are no criminal charges. No lawsuits. No bankruptcies. No tax issues. No complaints from former employers." Greg's expression remained calm. "Then perhaps you're looking in the wrong places." Randall understood immediately. "You want rumors. I want possibilities. They don't have to be true." Greg smiled faintly. "They simply have to make people ask questions." Randall sat quietly for several moments. "I don't fabricate documents." "I'm not asking you to. But if someone were to anonymously mention old gambling debts or financial problems, people might begin asking whether they're true." Randall slowly closed the notebook. "I'll think about it." After he left, Greg looked out the office window. He wasn't worried. If Randall refused, someone else wouldn't. Victoria noticed the atmosphere changing by midweek. Meetings ended more quickly whenever she entered. Conversations stopped. People smiled a little too politely. Karen knocked gently before entering her office. "Do you have a minute?" "Always." Karen closed the door. "I think you should know something." Victoria immediately sensed the concern. What is it? There are rumors. About me? Karen hesitated. About Jack. Victoria's expression hardened. What kind? Karen sighed. People are saying he's in financial trouble. Victoria frowned. Who started it? I don't know. They're saying he owes money. They're saying he lost a business. They're saying he may be hiding debts. Victoria stared across the office. None of that's true. As far as I know. Knew. She shook her head. I know Jack. Karen didn't answer. Victoria noticed. You don't believe them either. I don't. But rumors don't need believers. They only need listeners. Victoria rubbed her temples. I thought this would happen eventually. Karen spoke gently. Are you all right? Victoria looked toward the framed photograph of David on the bookshelf. When David was alive, nobody questioned who I had dinner with. Karen smiled sadly. They respected him. Knew. Victoria looked back at her. They respected his title. That evening Victoria called Jack. Are you busy? I'm replacing a kitchen faucet. She laughed. Yours? My neighbor's? Of course it is. What can I do for you? Her voice became serious. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Have you ever owned a business? Jack paused. Why? Just answer. Yes. When? A long time ago. Victoria sat upright. You never mentioned that. You never asked. What happened? Jack looked toward the old toolbox sitting in his garage. I sold it. Why? There was another pause. I'll tell you that I'd rather do it in person. Victoria noticed something different in his voice. Not fear, sadness. When can I see you? Tomorrow. I'll come to you. No? Jack smiled. I know a little diner. You and your diners. They've never let me down. She laughed softly. I'll meet you there. Across town, Olivia received another call from Frank Dawson. I've got an update. You found something. No. I wanted to tell you personally before someone else does. Olivia frowned. What do you mean? I've started hearing rumors. So have I. They aren't coming from me. I know. Frank's voice became firm. Listen carefully. Someone is trying to damage Jack Sullivan. What makes you think that? Because every rumor I've heard contradicts every document I've verified. Olivia looked out her apartment window. So they're false. I believe they are. Can you prove it? Eventually. But whoever started them isn't interested in proof. They're interested in timing. Olivia thanked him and ended the call. She stood silently for several minutes. She had wanted evidence. Not gossip. Something about this no longer felt like protecting her mother. It felt ugly. Friday morning brought the first anonymous envelope. No return address, no postage. Simply placed on the reception desk outside the executive offices. Karen opened it. Inside was a photocopy of what appeared to be a bank statement. Across the top, someone had circled several overdue balances in red ink. Attached was a typed note. Your CEO deserves to know who she's really dating. Karen immediately carried it into Victoria's office. Victoria studied the paperwork. Something felt wrong. The account numbers didn't match modern banking formats. Several dates were inconsistent. Even the font looked strange. She looked up. This is fake. Karen nodded. I thought so too. Victoria placed the papers back into the envelope. Has anyone else seen this? Only me. Good. She walked to the shredder. Without another word, she fed every page into the machine. Karen watched in surprise. You aren't going to investigate. Victoria smiled faintly. I trust the man, not anonymous envelopes. Karen smiled back. I was hoping you'd say that. Unfortunately, not everyone handled the envelope the same way. An identical package appeared that afternoon on the desk of one Bennett Manufacturing board member. Then another. Then another. By the end of the day, 7 directors had received nearly identical anonymous mail. Each contained slightly different financial documents, different account numbers, different balances, different banks, but the same conclusion. Jack Sullivan was supposedly drowning in debt. Most of the directors weren't convinced, but one quietly asked, should we verify this? Another answered, well, probably should. Greg Lawson sat silently at the far end of the conference table. Inside, he smiled. The lies didn't need to be perfect. They only needed to plant doubt, and doubt was always easier to grow than trust. Victoria Bennett had spent nearly 3 decades sitting across conference tables from people trying to persuade her. Suppliers, investors, lawyers, competitors. She had learned that the most dangerous conversations rarely began with accusations. They began with concern. That Tuesday morning, she walked into the executive boardroom and immediately recognized the look on several faces. No one smiled. No one joked about the weather. The atmosphere felt rehearsed. Greg Lawson stood as she entered. "Good morning, Victoria." "Morning." She took her usual seat at the head of the table. Karen distributed the quarterly reports while coffee was poured. Normally, the meeting would begin with production numbers. Instead, Richard Coleman, the oldest member of the board, cleared his throat. "Before we begin," Victoria looked up. "Yes, there is another matter." She folded her hands. "I'm listening." Richard exchanged a quick glance with 2 other directors. "We've received several anonymous communications. I assumed you had." The room grew quiet. Victoria's answer had surprised them. Richard continued carefully. "They concern Mr. Jack Sullivan. I know. And they're false." The statement came without hesitation. Another director, Margaret Ellis, leaned forward. "Victoria, we're not saying we believe them, but they exist." Victoria nodded. "They do. Have you investigated them?" "I didn't need to." Margaret frowned. "You didn't? Knew?" "I know Jack." Greg finally entered the conversation. Respectfully, knowing someone personally isn't the same as verifying information. Victoria turned toward him. "I've verified something much more important." "And what's that?" "His character." Greg smiled politely. "Character is admirable, but shareholders tend to prefer documentation." A few directors nodded. Victoria noticed, not agreement, uncertainty. Exactly what Greg wanted. Richard spoke again. "Victoria, no one here wishes to interfere in your personal life. But perception matters." Victoria looked around the room. "Does it?" "It does. If people begin questioning your judgment, they may begin questioning your leadership." The words hung in the air, not quite a threat, not quite advice, something in between. Victoria closed her folder. "If we're finished discussing anonymous lies, I'd like to return to running the company." No one spoke. The quarterly meeting finally began, but no one seemed interested in production numbers anymore. Meanwhile, Jack was helping finish the final inspection list at the community center. The city had approved occupancy. Children would return next month. The crew celebrated with pizza spread across folding tables. Tyler raised a paper cup. "To Jack." Everyone lifted theirs. Jack laughed. "To the crew." Miguel shook his head. "No, you always do that." "Do what?" "You redirect every compliment." Jack smiled. "Because they're usually meant for all of us." Miguel pointed around the room. "Exactly. That's why we're drinking to you." Laughter filled the building. For a little while, everything felt normal. That afternoon, Victoria drove to the little diner where she and Jack often met. He was already there. Same booth. Same black coffee. Same warm smile. "You look tired," he said. "I've had a long morning." He noticed immediately. "This isn't about work." She sat down. "No." The waitress poured her coffee without asking. "You've become regulars," she said with a smile. After she walked away, Victoria reached into her purse. She placed several photocopied pages on the table. Jack looked down. Bank statements, debt notices, loan defaults. He frowned. "I've never seen these before." "I know. They're fake." Jack studied them more carefully. "They're not even good fakes." Victoria smiled despite herself. "I thought the same thing." He handed the papers back. "So, they're trying to scare you. They're trying to scare the board." Jack leaned back. "Is it working?" She hesitated. "Some of them are nervous." He nodded slowly. "I figured." She watched him carefully. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." "Why?" Jack stirred his coffee. "Because people don't usually attack what doesn't matter." Victoria sighed. "I hate that you're right." He smiled. "I wish I wasn't." She reached across the table. "I trust you." "I know." "No." She squeezed his hand. I need you to hear me. I trust you. No matter what they say. Jack looked at her quietly, then smiled. Thank you. Across town, Ethan Bennett sat inside his office reviewing financial reports. His phone buzzed, unknown number. Normally he ignored those calls. Today, for some reason, he answered. Hello. The voice was disguised. You should ask your CFO about Raven Capital Holdings. The call ended. Ethan frowned. He stared at the phone. Raven Capital Holdings. The name meant nothing to him. Still, something about the caller's urgency bothered him. He opened the company's internal records. Nothing. He searched archived investment files. Nothing. Then he searched external corporate databases. One result appeared. A small investment company. Recently formed. No public activity. Minimal information. Odd. Very odd. He made a note to investigate later. That evening, Olivia stopped by her mother's house unannounced. Victoria opened the front door. Olivia, can we talk? Of course. They sat in the living room. For several moments neither spoke. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. I heard about the board meeting. Victoria looked surprised. Who told you? It doesn't matter. Maybe not. Olivia looked down. I didn't send those fake documents. Victoria's expression softened. I know. You believe me. I do. Olivia let out a slow breath. I wanted to find proof. Real proof, not. She struggled to find the word. This. Victoria nodded. I appreciate you telling me. Olivia looked toward the family photographs above the fireplace. One showed David laughing beside the children at the lake years earlier. I miss him. So do I. Another silence settled between them. Finally, Olivia asked the question she'd been avoiding for weeks. Do you love Jack? Victoria didn't answer immediately. She deserved honesty. I think. She smiled faintly. I'm falling in love with him. Olivia closed her eyes. Hearing the words hurt more than she expected. Not because she hated Jack. Because accepting them meant accepting that life had changed. That her father wasn't coming home. That someone else now made her mother smile. She quietly stood. I need some time. Victoria nodded. I know. As Olivia reached the door, Victoria spoke softly. You'll always be my daughter. No one can change that. Olivia looked back. I know. But I'm still afraid. She left before the tears could fall. Late that night, Greg Lawson remained alone in his office. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. He opened a secure laptop. A confidential spreadsheet filled the screen. Rows of company stock purchases. Hidden ownership percentages. Several shell corporations. One name appeared again and again. Raven Capital Holdings. Greg smiled. Everything was progressing exactly as planned. The rumors surrounding Jack were never the objective. They were only a distraction. While the Bennett family focused on defending a relationship, no one was paying attention to the company itself. Greg closed the laptop just as his private phone vibrated. A text message appeared. The board is beginning to ask questions. Greg replied with only 4 words. Keep them asking more. He slipped the phone into his pocket and turned off the office lights. Far below, the employees of Bennett Manufacturing drove home, believing they worked for one united company. They had no idea someone inside the building was quietly laying the foundation for something far more dangerous than gossip. He wasn't trying to destroy Jack Sullivan. He was trying to steal an empire, and before anyone realized it. The first pieces were already in place. Ethan Bennett had inherited more from his father than his last name. He had inherited David Bennett's habit of asking one more question. It had served his father well. It had built Bennett Manufacturing from a successful regional company into one respected across the country. It also meant Ethan rarely accepted easy answers, especially when something didn't feel right. The anonymous phone call about Raven Capital Holdings had stayed with him all week. Most people would have forgotten it. Ethan couldn't. Friday morning, before anyone else arrived, he unlocked his office and logged into the company's corporate records. He searched every acquisition, every vendor, every investment. Nothing. The company wasn't connected to Bennett Manufacturing in any obvious way. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it bothered him even more. Because if the company truly had no connection to Bennett Manufacturing, why would someone risk making an anonymous call? He picked up the phone. Melissa. His assistant answered immediately. Good morning. I need every public filing on a company called Raven Capital Holdings. I'll have them within the hour. Thank you. He leaned back in his chair. His father used to tell him something when he was a teenager. When people try too hard to make you look one direction, kiss look the other way. For the first time, Ethan wondered if everyone, including Olivia, had been looking at Jack Sullivan while someone else quietly slipped through the shadows. Across town, Jack had no idea his name had become the center of conversations inside a boardroom. His biggest concern that morning was helping Mrs. Eleanor Peterson replace her front porch steps. She was 78 years old and had lived alone since losing her husband nearly a decade earlier. Jack had known the Peterson family for years. Mrs. Peterson stood on the lawn with a glass of lemonade. You know, you've been fixing things around this neighborhood for so long. I don't think people remember which jobs they actually paid you for. Jack smiled while driving another screw into the railing. I've forgotten most of them myself. She shook her head. That's because you never keep score. Jack climbed down from the ladder. I had a lot of people help me when Linda got sick. This is just my way of paying some of it forward. Mrs. Peterson smiled. That's a debt you'll never finish paying. Jack looked around the quiet neighborhood. I hope not. Before leaving, she insisted he take a homemade apple pie. I can't accept this. You can. I've already been paid. She folded her arms. Not arguing. Jack laughed. I've learned that's usually a losing battle. It is. As he loaded the pie into his truck, he noticed someone watching from across the street. A man in a dark sedan. The stranger looked away as soon as their eyes met. Jack frowned for a moment, then dismissed it. Maybe someone waiting for a friend. Maybe a delivery driver. He thought nothing more about it. The man wasn't waiting for a friend. He was taking photographs. At Bennett Manufacturing, Karen quietly knocked on Victoria's office door. You have visitors. Victoria looked up from her paperwork. The board. Karen nodded. They've requested a private meeting. Victoria already knew what it would be about. Send them in. Within moments, 4 directors entered: Richard Coleman, Margaret Ellis, Daniel Brooks, and Greg Lawson. Victoria remained seated. What can I do for everyone? Richard spoke first. This isn't an official meeting. Then speak freely. Margaret leaned forward. We're concerned. Victoria smiled faintly. So I've noticed. It's about appearances. There it is again. Victoria folded her hands. That word. Greg answered calmly. Appearances matter in business. Do they matter more than truth? No. But investors react to perception. Victoria looked directly at him. Investors. You've mentioned them quite a lot recently. Greg smiled politely. They're important. So are employees. So is integrity. So is trust. The room became quiet. Daniel finally spoke. No one is asking you to end your relationship. Victoria raised an eyebrow. No. We're asking you to slow it down. She stared at him. What exactly does that mean? Richard answered carefully. Perhaps avoid public appearances together. Victoria couldn't believe what she was hearing. You want me to hide him? No. Jest. Richard searched for the right words. Be mindful. Victoria stood. For the first time in years, every director instinctively straightened in their chairs. My husband and I built this company on one principle. She looked at each of them. Why never made decisions based on fear? She turned toward Greg. I'm certainly not going to start now. No one replied. The meeting ended only a few minutes later. As the directors filed out, Greg lingered. You know this could become much bigger than a relationship. Victoria met his eyes. I think it already has. Greg smiled politely. You may be right. He walked away. Victoria watched him disappear down the hallway. Something about him felt different, not hostile, calculated. For the first time, she wondered if the rumors about Jack weren't actually about Jack at all. That evening, Ethan spread dozens of printed documents across his dining room table. corporate registrations, property records, investment disclosures, financial statements. Hours passed. Nothing connected. Until one small detail caught his eye. Raven Capital Holdings listed its registered office in a downtown building. He recognized the address immediately. Not because of the company. Because Bennett Manufacturing leased office space on the same floor. He frowned. That couldn't be a coincidence. He searched the building directory. Raven Capital occupied Suite 1408. Bennett Manufacturing's legal department occupied Suite 1406, 2 doors apart, yet no one had ever mentioned them. Ethan picked up his phone. Melissa? Still working? Apparently. I need one more thing. Of course. I want every company that has purchased Bennett Manufacturing stock during the past 18 months. There was a pause. That's a long list. I know. But I have a feeling one name is going to appear more than once. Across town, Olivia sat alone in her apartment staring at one of the photographs she'd taken weeks earlier. Jack and Victoria. Laughing outside the coffee shop, she remembered how convinced she'd been that day. Certain he had hidden motives. Certain he didn't belong. Now, she wasn't nearly as certain. Her phone buzzed. Greg, have you heard anything new? New Po? The rumors are spreading. I know. They aren't helping. Greg paused. Sometimes unpleasant things are necessary. Olivia frowned. What do you mean? If your mother realizes Jack is becoming a liability, she'll end the relationship herself. Something about the sentence unsettled her. Liability. Not person. Not man. Not relationship. Liability. After ending the call, Olivia sat quietly. For the first time, Greg's concern sounded less like concern, and more like strategy. Late Saturday afternoon, Jack met Victoria at the community center. Children raced through the newly restored gymnasium during the grand reopening celebration. Parents filled the bleachers. Volunteers proudly showed visitors around the building. The little boy Jack had given the basketball to weeks earlier ran across the court. Mimestra, Jack. Jack laughed as the boy nearly tackled him with a hug. Easy there. You'll knock these old bones loose. My team's practicing here now. I heard. The boy grinned. I made 2 baskets yesterday. Jack looked impressed. Only 2. I'm saving the rest for next game. Victoria laughed. I think that's called confidence. The boy's mother walked over. We've been hoping to thank you again. You already have. No. She smiled. You gave him more than a basketball. You gave him hope. She led her son back toward the court. Victoria looked at Jack. Do people always say things like that to you? Jack shrugged. I think people remember kindness more than the person doing it. She slipped her hand into his. I remember both. Neither noticed the photographer standing across the gymnasium. He wasn't from the local newspaper. He worked for someone else. His camera clicked several more times before he quietly walked away. By Monday morning, those photographs would be sitting on Greg Lawson's desk, and Greg finally believed he had enough pieces to begin the next phase of his plan. Sunday afternoon arrived with clear skies over Ravenwood. Jack stood in his kitchen staring at a peach cobbler cooling on the counter. He wasn't much of a baker. Certainly not compared to Linda. The edges were slightly darker than he'd intended. One corner had risen higher than the other. But it smelled good. He hoped that counted for something. His phone rang. Victoria. How's the masterpiece coming along? Jack laughed. I think calling it a masterpiece is generous. So it survived the oven. Barely. I'll take that as a success. She smiled on the other end of the line. You don't have to bring dessert. I know. I'm bringing it anyway. I had a feeling you would. Jack hesitated. You sure about tonight? There was a brief silence. You're asking about Olivia? I am. Victoria sighed softly. I can't keep the 2 most important parts of my life separated forever. I know. I just don't want dinner turning into a courtroom. I don't either. She paused. But Ethan will be there, Jack smiled. That helps. It helps me too. I'll see you at 6. Victoria's home sat on a quiet tree-lined street overlooking Ravenwood Lake. It wasn't the largest house in the neighborhood, but it was elegant. Brick, white columns, wide front porch. A home built for family instead of display. Jack parked his pickup beside Ethan's SUV. He looked at the cobbler one last time. You've got one chance to impress people. The cobbler remained unimpressed. Jack laughed at himself, picked up the baking dish, and walked toward the front door. Victoria answered almost immediately. You made it. I said I would. Her eyes dropped to the dish in his hands. You actually baked. I'd lower your expectations. She laughed. I wasn't expecting dessert. I wasn't expecting it to survive. Victoria stepped aside. Come in. The house smelled of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and herbs. It smelled like Sunday dinners, the kind Jack hadn't experienced in years. Family photographs lined the hallway. David holding a fishing rod with Ethan. Olivia wearing a graduation gown. Christmas mornings. Beach vacations. Birthdays. A lifetime captured in frames. Jack slowed as he looked at them. Victoria noticed. We never took many photographs after David died. The Jack nodded. I understand. She quietly reached for his hand. You don't have to pretend you understand. You actually do. Before either of them could say anything else, Ethan entered from the dining room. He smiled warmly. You must be Jack. Jack offered his hand. You must be Ethan. It's nice to finally meet you. You too. Ethan shook his hand firmly. I've heard a lot about you. I hope not all from Miguel. Ethan looked confused. Who's Miguel? Jack laughed. Never mind. Victoria smiled. I'll explain later. The atmosphere immediately relaxed. Ethan had inherited his father's easygoing nature. Within minutes he and Jack were talking about baseball, home repairs, and the never-ending debate over whether old trucks were more reliable than new ones. You still drive a 98? Ethan asked. 99. Original engine. Jack grinned. Mostly. It complains more than I do. Ethan laughed. I already like you. Victoria watched the conversation with quiet gratitude. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine holidays, birthdays, ordinary family dinners, maybe, just maybe, a future. Then the front door opened. Olivia had arrived. She entered carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. The smile she'd practiced disappeared the moment she saw Jack standing in the living room. You invited him. Victoria remained calm. I told you I would. Olivia set the bottle on the counter a little harder than she intended. I thought you meant another day. I meant today. Jack stepped forward. Good evening, Olivia. She looked at him politely. Jack. Nothing more. Ethan immediately sensed the tension. Come on. Dinner's almost ready. Everyone moved toward the dining room. Conversation remained polite. Weather, traffic, the community center reopening, safe topics. Jack intentionally spoke less than usual. He didn't want Olivia to feel cornered in her own mother's home. Victoria noticed. She appreciated it. Dinner began quietly. The roasted chicken disappeared quickly. So did Ethan's mashed potatoes. Even Olivia complimented the vegetables. For nearly 20 minutes. Everything felt almost normal. Then Olivia placed her fork down. So? The room immediately became still. Jack looked up. Olivia folded her hands. I've been meaning to ask you something. Victoria sighed. Olivia, no? She looked at her mother. I'd rather ask directly. Jack nodded gently. Go ahead. Olivia looked straight at him. What are your intentions with my mother? The words landed heavily. Jack answered honestly. To make her happy. Olivia didn't blink. That's a nice answer. It's also true. What happens when she's not enough? Victoria closed her eyes. Olivia. When the excitement wears off. When you realize dating a CEO isn't what you expected. Jack remained calm. I don't think your mother is exciting because she's a CEO. Then why? Because she makes me laugh. No one spoke. Jack continued quietly. She asks how my day went. She remembers small things. She notices when I'm tired. She treats waiters the same way she treats executives. He smiled toward Victoria. That's rare. Olivia folded her arms. You still haven't answered my question. I did. No. You avoided it. She leaned forward. My father spent 33 years loving my mother. Can you honestly tell me you'll do the same? Jack looked down for a moment before answering. No. The room fell silent. Victoria looked at him, surprised. Olivia almost smiled. So you admit it. Jack slowly looked back up. No, I admit something else. He folded his hands on the table. I can't promise anyone 33 years. No one can. I couldn't promise Linda that. Cancer took that promise away. His voice remained steady. The only promise I can honestly make is that if your mother chooses to spend tomorrow with me, I'll spend tomorrow loving her the best I know how. And if we're given another day, I do it again. And another. And another. And another. That's the only promise life has ever allowed me to keep. Silence filled the dining room. Even Olivia hadn't expected that answer. Jack looked toward her kindly. I loved my wife until the day she died. I didn't stop because I wanted to. I stopped because life decided for me. If your mother and I continue seeing each other, I'll never treat what we have as something temporary. But I also won't make promises that only God can keep. Ethan slowly lowered his fork. Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes. Olivia looked away first. The answer had been too honest to dismiss. Yet she wasn't ready to accept it. She pushed back her chair. I need some air. She walked onto the back patio. The sliding door closed behind her. Victoria started to stand. Jack gently touched her arm. I'll go. She looked uncertain. Are you sure? He nodded. I'm sure. Olivia stood looking across the lake. The evening breeze carried the sound of crickets. She heard the patio door slide open behind her. Jack stopped several feet away. He didn't stand beside her. He gave her space. After nearly a minute, Olivia spoke. You really loved your wife. Very much. You still do. I always will. She looked down. Doesn't that make it unfair to my mother? Jack smiled softly. No. Love isn't a room with only one chair. Olivia frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means losing someone didn't leave my heart empty. It made it bigger. So there's room to love again. Without loving the first person less. Olivia had never thought about grief that way. She remained silent. Jack continued. I know why you're afraid. She looked at him. You do. I think so. You believe if someone hurts your mother, you'll lose part of her too. Olivia's eyes filled. I already lost Dad. I know. I watched what that did to her. I can't watch it happen again. Jack nodded. I wouldn't ask you to. He looked out across the water. If I ever become the reason your mother stops smiling, I'll walk away myself. Olivia stared at him. You'd do that? Without hesitation. Why? Because loving someone sometimes means putting them first. The words settled heavily between them. For the first time, Olivia didn't see a man chasing her mother's wealth. She saw a widower who understood loss as deeply as she did. She wasn't ready to trust him. But she was no longer certain she was fighting the right battle. Inside the house, Ethan quietly walked into his father's old study. He needed a moment to think. Instead, he noticed a familiar name on a folder sticking out of one of David Bennett's old filing cabinets. Raven Capital Holdings. Ethan froze. His father had known that name. Years before the anonymous phone call. Years before the rumors. Slowly, he pulled the folder from the drawer. His pulse quickened. Whatever was inside might explain everything. 2. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more heartfelt stories like this every week. Now let's find out what David Bennett discovered before anyone else did. Ethan stared at the faded file folder in his father's old study. Dust covered the tab. The ink had faded enough that someone else might have overlooked it. But one name remained perfectly readable. Raven Capital Holdings. His heartbeat quickened. His father had retired from day-to-day operations before he passed away, but he had never stopped paying attention to the business. If David Bennett had kept this file, there had been a reason. Ethan carried it to the desk and carefully opened it. Inside were handwritten notes, copies of public filings, several newspaper clippings, and one yellow sticky note attached to the front page. In his father's familiar handwriting were only 6 words. Keep watching, something feels wrong. Ethan leaned back slowly. His father had suspected something. Years ago. Long before anonymous phone calls. Long before Jack Sullivan had entered their lives. He continued reading. The document suggested Raven Capital Holdings had quietly purchased small amounts of stock in several family-owned manufacturing companies across the Midwest, never enough to attract attention, never enough to trigger regulatory disclosures, always just below reporting thresholds. David had circled the same pattern again and again. Kess, Cheffer's small purchases, multiple shell companies, hidden coordination. Ethan frowned. This wasn't proof, but it was enough to justify asking questions. Questions someone clearly didn't want asked. His phone buzzed. Melissa, I found the shareholder list you requested. And there are 4 companies buying Bennett Manufacturing stock. 3 are familiar. The 4th, she hesitated, is Raven Capital Holdings. Ethan closed his eyes. There it was. The first real connection. Said everything to my personal email. Not the company account. Understood. After ending the call, he looked once more at his father's note. Keep watching. I think you were trying to warn us, Dad. I think following afternoon, Victoria met Jack at their favorite diner. The waitress smiled as soon as they walked in. Your usual booth. Jack laughed. Do we already have a usual booth? You've earned it. Victoria smiled. I like the sound of that. They slid into the corner booth overlooking the street. Coffee arrived before either of them ordered it. I think she's memorized us, Victoria said. Jack looked at the mugs. I've always admired efficiency. For a few minutes they talked about ordinary things. The community center. The weather. Miguel's latest attempt to convince Jack to buy a newer truck. Then Victoria noticed something. Jack seemed quieter than usual. What are you thinking about? He smiled faintly. You always notice. I do. He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. You asked me something last week. I did. You asked whether I'd ever owned a business. Victoria nodded. You said you'd tell me the story. Jack looked out the window for a long moment. I suppose it's time. He took a slow breath. When Linda got sick, his voice softened. I owned Sullivan Construction. Victoria looked surprised. You were the owner. For nearly 15 years. I started it with 1 truck. Eventually we had almost 70 employees. Victoria stared at him. You never told me. It never seemed important. It is now. Jack smiled sadly. When Linda was diagnosed, our insurance covered most of the treatment. But not all of it. He looked down at his hands. The doctors recommended an experimental therapy. It wasn't guaranteed, but they believed it gave her a chance. Victoria listened without saying a word. It cost more money than we had. So, I sold the company. She blinked. You sold everything? The business, the equipment, the office, my retirement, the vacation cabin we'd saved for. He smiled gently. It still wasn't enough. Victoria felt her chest tighten. What happened? We got another year. His eyes became distant. 12 more months. 12 birthdays. 12 anniversaries. 12 mornings drinking coffee together. He looked at Victoria. If someone offered me the chance to do it again, knowing we'd still lose her, I'd sign the papers before they finished asking. Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. You gave up everything. Jack shook his head. No. I traded money. For time. His smile trembled. It was the best investment I ever made. Victoria couldn't speak. She simply held his hand. After several quiet moments, she finally whispered, Why didn't you ever rebuild the company? Jack shrugged gently. I could have. But after Linda was gone, I realized I enjoyed being on the job site more than sitting behind a desk. So I went back to doing what I loved. You never regretted it. Not once. Victoria looked at the rough hands resting beneath hers, hands that had built homes, schools, community centers, hands that had once signed away a successful company, without hesitation, not for profit, not for pride, for love. She suddenly understood why every person she met spoke about Jack with such respect. Integrity wasn't something he talked about. It was simply how he lived. Across town, Olivia sat in Frank Dawson's office. The private investigator slid another folder across the desk. I told you I'd keep looking. She opened it. Inside were photographs, employment records, former business registrations. One document immediately caught her attention. Sullivan Construction Incorporated. Her eyes widened. He owned a construction company. Frank nodded. A successful one. Why did he sell it? I wondered the same thing. He handed her another document. Medical billing summaries. Insurance records. Dates. Treatment schedules. She looked up. This is his late wife's cancer treatment. Olivia slowly read through the timeline. Business sold. Treatment began. Company dissolved. Hospital payments made. Everything matched. There were no hidden offshore accounts. No mysterious investments, no secret fortune. Just a husband trying to buy his wife more time. Frank leaned back quietly. I've investigated a lot of people. Very few impress me. Jack Sullivan did. Olivia swallowed hard. I accused him of chasing my mother's money. Frank nodded. It appears he already gave away most of his own. She closed the folder. For the first time since this all began, shame replaced suspicion. Late that evening, Greg Lawson stood alone in the executive parking garage. His phone rang. Talk to me. The voice on the other end sounded nervous. We have a problem. What now? The investigator found Sullivan's old company. Greg frowned. So, they also found out why he sold it. Greg remained silent. The sympathy angle is going to make attacking him much harder. A slow smile spread across Greg's face. Then we stop attacking the man. The caller hesitated. What do you mean? Greg unlocked his car. If people won't believe Jack is dishonest, we'll convince them he's dangerous. He climbed into the driver's seat. Start preparing the next package. What should it say? Greg started the engine. This time, we're giving the board something they can't ignore. He ended the call before another question could be asked. As his car disappeared into the night, the parking garage fell silent once more. Greg wasn't worried that people admired Jack Sullivan. Sometimes, the fastest way to destroy a good man wasn't to make people hate him. It was to make them afraid of what standing beside him might cost. Victoria Bennett had always believed trust was built slowly. One honest decision, one difficult conversation, one kept promise at a time. Unfortunately, fear spread much faster. By Wednesday morning, she felt it the moment she stepped onto the executive floor. Employees still greeted her. They still smiled. But conversations ended just a little too quickly. Eyes lingered just a little too long. Something had changed. Karen followed her into the office carrying the day's schedule. You have 3 meetings before lunch. Victoria nodded. And? Karen hesitated. The board requested an emergency executive session. Victoria looked up. They gave a reason. They simply marked it as urgent. Victoria leaned back in her chair. She didn't like surprises, especially ones scheduled by the board. An hour later, the directors gathered around the long walnut conference table. Every chair was filled. Even members who normally attended remotely had arrived in person. That alone told Victoria this wasn't routine. Richard Coleman cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. Victoria folded her hands. What requires an emergency meeting? Before Richard could answer, Greg Lawson slid a thick folder across the table. I believe everyone has received a copy. Victoria looked down. The cover read, Est Confidential Risk Assessment. She frowned. What is this? Greg answered calmly. Information regarding your relationship with Mr. Jack Sullivan. Victoria didn't open it. I've had enough anonymous fiction. This isn't anonymous. It was delivered through a consulting firm. Karen, sitting quietly along the wall taking notes, immediately noticed something. There was no company logo, no consulting firm's name, no author. Nothing. Victoria noticed it too. Interesting. Greg smiled politely. What is? You've presented an official report. Without identifying who prepared it. The room grew quiet. Greg didn't miss a beat. The source requested confidentiality. Victoria pushed the folder away unopened. I'm not reading unsigned accusations. Margaret Ellis spoke gently. Victoria, perhaps you should. No. Richard sighed. We already have. And he looked uncomfortable. It suggests Mr. Sullivan previously owned a construction company. Victoria blinked. I know. Several directors looked surprised. Greg's expression changed for only a fraction of a second. You knew. I did. He sold it to pay for his wife's cancer treatment. Silence. Margaret slowly lowered the papers in front of her. That's not what this report says. Victoria finally opened the folder. The first page claimed Sullivan Construction had collapsed because of severe financial mismanagement. The second implied unpaid creditors. The third suggested suspicious asset transfers. Victoria looked up. It's a lie. Greg remained calm. We're simply asking questions. No. She tapped the report. You're presenting conclusions. She turned another page. The timeline was wrong. Dates didn't match. The alleged debts occurred months after the company had already been sold. Whoever assembled the report hadn't expected anyone to know the real story. Victoria looked around the table. Did any of you verify this? No one answered. Richard finally admitted, reassumed the consulting firm had. Victoria closed the folder. My relationship has made all of you so nervous that you accepted anonymous paperwork over my word. Nobody looked at her. Because she was right. Across town, Jack finished replacing a broken wheelchair ramp at the home of a retired schoolteacher. As he loaded his tools into the truck, Mrs. Helen Brooks stepped onto the porch. I baked cookies. Jack laughed. You people keep trying to feed me. You keep refusing payment. So we're even. She handed him a small tin. He accepted it with a smile. Thank you. As he climbed into his truck, his phone rang. Victoria. He answered immediately. You sound tired. I am. What happened? She hesitated. The board held an emergency meeting. Jack leaned back in his seat. About us. Wes. He wasn't surprised. What do they want? They're frightened. Off me. No. She looked out her office window as she spoke. They're frightened of headlines. Jack nodded slowly. And frightened people make poor decisions. She smiled sadly. You always make everything sound simple. It usually is. There was a pause. Finally Jack asked, What are you going to do? Victoria answered without hesitation. The same thing I've always done. I'm going to tell the truth. That afternoon, Ethan received the shareholder records Melissa had compiled. He spread them across his desk. One company immediately stood out. Raven Capital Holdings. Over 18 months. It had quietly increased its ownership, never dramatically. Always in small increments, 1%, then another half, then another. But something else caught Ethan's attention. Several other investment firms had made nearly identical purchases. Different names, different addresses, same law firm, same filing agent, same pattern. His pulse quickened. He searched the corporate registrations. Every company traced back to a different owner. Yet everyone used the same legal representative. That wasn't normal. He picked up the phone. Melissa. Yes. I need every corporate filing handled by Harrison and Bell Legal Services during the past 3 years. The law firm? Yes. She hesitated. That's going to take time. I know. But I think we're finally looking in the right direction. Meanwhile, Olivia sat alone at her apartment dining table. Frank Dawson's investigation folder remained open beside her. She had read the documents 3 times. Every page made her feel worse. She remembered standing in the hotel ballroom, asking Jack what he had to offer her mother. She remembered the certainty in her own voice. Now, she wasn't certain about anything. Her phone buzzed. Victoria. She almost ignored it. Instead, she answered. Hi, Mom. Can you come by tonight? Olivia hesitated. Is everything okay? I'd just like to see you. An hour later, she walked into her mother's kitchen. Victoria was making tea, just like she used to after difficult days. Without saying a word, she handed Olivia a mug. They sat together in silence. Finally, Olivia spoke. I was wrong. Victoria looked at her. I investigated Jack. I know. I found out why he sold his company. Victoria didn't answer. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I thought he wanted your money. He gave away everything he'd have, trying to save someone he loved. Her voice broke. I accused a good man. Victoria reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. You were trying to protect me. I hurt him. Yes, the honesty surprised Olivia. Victoria continued softly. You did. But hurting someone doesn't have to be the end of the story. Olivia wiped away a tear. What if he never forgives me? Victoria smiled gently. Then you respect that. But, she squeezed her daughter's hand. I know Jack. If your apology is sincere, he'll listen. Olivia nodded slowly. Not today. She wasn't ready yet. But for the first time, she wanted to apologize. Late that evening, Greg Lawson entered a private conference room on the top floor. Waiting inside were 2 board members. Not officially, unofficially. Greg closed the door. We're running out of time. Richard frowned. What do you mean? The company's reputation is becoming tied to Victoria's personal decisions. Margaret looked uncomfortable. I still don't think Jack Sullivan is the problem. Greg smiled. Perhaps. But markets don't care whether rumors are true. They care whether investors believe them. Richard rubbed his forehead. What exactly are you suggesting? Greg slid a single sheet of paper across the table. At the top were only 7 words. Special vote of confidence. CEO leadership. Margaret looked up sharply. You want the board to vote? Only as a precaution. Richard stared at the page. If she loses. Greg nodded. She would be expected to resign. Silence settled over the room. Neither director wanted that outcome, but both now carried doubt, exactly as Greg had planned. As they quietly left the conference room one by one, Greg remained behind. He looked out over the lights of Ravenwood. The first rumor created doubt. The second created fear. He smiled to himself. No. It's time to make them choose. Somewhere across the city, Jack Sullivan was washing sawdust from his hands after another honest day's work. He had no idea that, within days, the woman he loved might be asked to choose between her company and him. Victoria Bennett had faced difficult decisions before. She had decided whether to close factories during recessions, whether to lay off employees to keep the company alive, whether to invest millions in new equipment when failure could have destroyed everything her parents had built. Those decisions had been painful. This one felt personal. Friday morning, she stood alone in her office looking out over Ravenwood. The city was waking up beneath a grey sky. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Karen knocked gently before entering. They're all here. Victoria nodded without turning around. The board. Karen gave a quiet nod. They're ready. Victoria closed her eyes for just a moment. Thank you. She straightened her jacket, picked up her notebook, and walked toward the boardroom. No one spoke as she entered. The atmosphere felt heavier than any meeting she could remember. Every director sat in silence. Even Greg Lawson appeared unusually restrained. Richard Coleman cleared his throat. This meeting has been called under Article 7 of the company charter. Victoria took her seat. I've read the agenda. Richard nodded. Then you understand the purpose. I do. A folder rested in front of every board member. Its title was simple. Vote of confidence. Victoria looked around the table. I've served this company for 28 years. I've worked beside many of you for nearly that long. She smiled sadly. And today we're here because I'm having dinner with someone. Nobody answered. Margaret Ellis shifted uncomfortably. It's more complicated than that, is it? Victoria folded her hands. Then explain it to me. Richard spoke carefully. The board believes your relationship has become a distraction. A distraction. Victoria repeated the words quietly. Greg finally spoke. Public confidence affects shareholder confidence, and shareholder confidence affects everyone. Victoria looked directly at him. So we're discussing stock prices. No. We're discussing leadership. She nodded slowly. I thought so. Richard took a deep breath. No one wants you to resign. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Then why print resignation procedures in the meeting packet? Silence. Several directors looked down at their folders. Greg remained perfectly still. Victoria opened the packet. There it was, a draft resignation letter, already prepared. She closed the folder again. So, the decision was made before I entered the room. No, Richard said quickly. Wasn't. Victoria looked at him kindly. Richard, you've never been a good liar. The elderly director lowered his eyes. Across town, Jack was replacing damaged fencing at the community center playground. Several neighborhood children watched from a safe distance. One little girl tugged on his sleeve. "Mr. Jack," he smiled. "Yeah, my mommy says you're fixing everything." Jack laughed. "I wish I could." She thought about that answer. "Can you fix broken swings?" "I can." "What about broken bikes?" "Sometimes." She smiled brightly. "What about broken hearts?" Jack's smile faded just a little. "I wish those were as easy." The little girl nodded seriously. "My grandma says hugs help." Jack chuckled. "Your grandma sounds pretty smart." She nodded proudly. "She is." As the children ran back toward the playground, Miguel walked over. "You all right?" Jack looked toward the clouds gathering overhead. "I've got a strange feeling." "What kind?" "Like something's coming." Miguel shrugged. "Rain," Jack smiled. "I hope that's all it is." The board meeting stretched into its second hour. Every financial report showed Bennett Manufacturing performing well. Revenue had increased. Employee retention remained among the highest in the industry. Customer satisfaction was strong, by every measurable standard. Victoria had succeeded, yet the discussion kept returning to one subject: Jack Sullivan. Margaret finally spoke. "I've reviewed every accusation. I haven't found evidence that Mr. Sullivan has done anything wrong." Daniel Brooks nodded. "Neither have I." Greg leaned forward. "Sometimes leadership isn't about wrongdoing. It's about perception." Victoria sighed quietly. "There it is again." Greg continued. "Whether fair or unfair, the company's reputation is becoming linked to your personal relationship." Victoria looked around the room. "So let me understand. If I continue seeing Jack, this board may remove me as CEO." Richard answered honestly. "There are directors considering that possibility." Victoria nodded. "I appreciate the honesty." She stood and walked toward the windows. For several moments she simply watched the rain. Finally she turned back toward the board. "My father built this company with 12 employees. My husband helped grow it into thousands. They taught me something I hope none of you have forgotten." She looked at every face in the room. "If fear starts making our decisions, we stop deserving the people who trust us." Nobody spoke. Victoria continued. "You all know Jack Sullivan has done nothing dishonest. You know the reports are false. You know the rumors were manufactured." Richard quietly nodded. "Yes, and yet, you're asking me to end my relationship anyway." Margaret looked down. "Because people believe the rumors." Victoria smiled sadly. "Then perhaps our responsibility isn't to surrender to lies. It's to stand against them." Silence filled the room. Even Greg couldn't immediately respond. That evening, Ethan sat inside his office, surrounded by documents. Melissa entered carrying another stack of files. "I found something." He looked up immediately. "What?" She placed several incorporation records on his desk. "These 6 investment companies. They all use Harrison and Bell." "I know. But look at the mailing addresses." Ethan compared them. His eyes widened. Every company used a different office suite. Same building. Same floor. Different suite numbers. He quickly searched the property records. The building owner leased every one of those offices, Paxson, to the same management company, a shell corporation. Ethan leaned back. "This isn't random." Melissa nodded. "I don't think so either." He looked at the wall where an old photograph of his father hung. "We're getting close." Later that night, Victoria arrived at Jack's house. She hadn't called first. She simply needed to see him. Jack opened the front door. The moment he saw her face, he knew. "They finally said it." She nodded. "They want me to choose." He stepped aside. "Come in." She walked into the modest living room. Nothing had changed since her last visit. Linda's piano still stood against one wall. Family photographs rested on the mantel. The house felt lived in, loved, safe. Victoria sat on the couch. "They didn't give me an ultimatum. But they didn't have to." Jack quietly sat across from her. "They're hoping you'll make the decision for them." "Wes!" She laughed bitterly. "They called it protecting the company." Jack remained silent. After a long pause, he spoke softly. "I think you should listen to them." Victoria looked at him in disbelief. "What? I think?" He struggled to force the words out. "You should let me go." The room became perfectly still. Victoria stared at him. You can't possibly mean that. I do. No. She shook her head firmly. I know exactly what you're doing. Do you? You're trying to protect me. Jack smiled sadly. I've never been very good at doing anything else. She moved closer. I'm not losing another person because they think sacrificing themselves is noble. This is different. New. Her voice trembled. It's exactly the same. She took both of his hands. I spent 5 years believing my life was over. You changed that. I'm not walking away because frightened people told me to. Jack looked down. If staying with me costs you the company, I can live with that. Victoria gently lifted his chin until he looked at her again. I can't. He frowned. You just said. I can't live with knowing I abandoned the man I love. Because other people demanded it. The words hung between them. Neither of them had said them before. Not out loud. Jack's eyes softened. You love me. Victoria smiled through tears. I do. She laughed quietly. I didn't plan to say it like this. Jack reached up and brushed away a tear from her cheek. I love you too. For a brief moment, the world outside disappeared. No board, no rumors, no company. Just two people who had found each other after believing love belonged only in their past. They embraced quietly. Neither noticed the headlights slowing outside Jack's house. A camera lens emerged slightly through a half-open window. Click. 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 Several photographs were taken. The car drove away without stopping. Inside, Jack and Victoria had no idea. By morning, those photographs would be sitting on every board member's desk, along with one anonymous note. The CEO has chosen him over the company. Yet, Monday morning began with another anonymous envelope. This time, every member of the Bennett Manufacturing Board received it before arriving at work. Inside were several photographs. Jack and Victoria standing on his front porch. Jack wiping tears from Victoria's face. The two of them embracing. To anyone who knew the full story, they were photographs of two people comforting one another after an impossible conversation. To someone looking for scandal, they told a very different story. Attached was a single typed sentence. Essay how long before personal feelings begin influencing corporate decisions. By 9 o'clock, the boardroom was quieter than anyone could remember. No one wanted to be the first to speak. Finally, Richard Coleman placed the photographs face down on the table. I don't like this. Margaret nodded. Neither do I. Daniel sighed. Whoever keeps sending these. They're watching Victoria. Greg folded his hands. Perhaps. That doesn't change what the photographs show. Richard looked directly at him. They show two adults embracing. They don't show misconduct. Greg smiled politely. They show perception. Margaret rubbed her temples. I'm getting tired of that word. So am I. Richard leaned back. We're discussing pictures instead of quarterly performance. Greg answered calmly. Because the pictures may affect quarterly performance. Silence settled over the room once again. The conversation had become a circle. Exactly as Greg intended. Across town, Ethan Bennett sat inside the legal archives with stacks of corporate filings, covering nearly every available surface. Melissa placed another folder beside him. I finally found the ownership records. For Harrison and Bell. She nodded, and every company connected to them. Ethan opened the folder immediately. Minutes passed. His expression slowly changed. No. Melissa looked worried. What? He slid one document across the desk. The registered agent for Raven Capital Holdings was listed, not Greg Lawson. That would have been too obvious. Instead, the paperwork pointed toward another limited liability company, then another, and another. 4 shell corporations. 3 different states. 7 nominee directors. Whoever built this structure had spent years hiding ownership. Melissa frowned. Can anyone even untangle this? Ethan smiled slightly. They already did. She looked confused. What? He tapped one page. They made one mistake. What mistake? They reused the same accounting firm. Melissa leaned closer. He pointed toward 3 separate filings. Different companies. Different addresses. Different directors. Same accounting firm. Same partner. Same signature. It wasn't proof. But it was finally something solid. Ethan looked at the clock. I need to talk to someone. Meanwhile, Jack arrived at the community center carrying a toolbox in one hand and Mrs. Peterson's empty pie tin in the other. Miguel noticed immediately. She made you return the tin. Jack laughed. Apparently keeping pie tins is considered theft. I'll remember that. As they walked inside, Tyler hurried toward them carrying a newspaper. Jack. You made the front page. Jack frowned. I did. Tyler unfolded the paper. The headline celebrated the reopening of the Jefferson Community Center. Across the top stretched a large photograph of neighborhood children playing basketball beneath the new lights. Near the center stood Jack, smiling, watching the kids instead of the camera. The article praised volunteers, donors, and local businesses. Jack skimmed it quickly. They got Miguel's name wrong. Miguel grabbed the paper. They did. They called you Michael. Miguel looked horrified. That's the problem you noticed. Jack shrugged. They fixed the building. My name doesn't matter. Miguel laughed. You really are impossible. Late that afternoon, Ethan pulled into the parking lot outside Jack's house. He had never visited before. The modest home looked exactly the way he imagined. Freshly painted, neatly kept. Flowers growing beside the front porch. Nothing extravagant, everything cared for. Jack answered the door wearing jeans covered in sawdust. Ethan. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. Come in. The smell of fresh coffee filled the house. Jack led him into the kitchen. What can I do for you? Ethan looked around for a moment before speaking. I owe you an apology. Jack looked surprised. For what? My sister. Jack smiled gently. She's trying to protect her mother. I know. But I should have spoken up sooner. Jack poured 2 cups of coffee. You spoke up when it mattered. Ethan accepted the mug. Not enough. They sat quietly at the kitchen table. Finally, Ethan leaned forward. I don't think you're the real target. Jack raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I've been investigating Raven Capital Holdings. The Jack frowned. I've never heard of them. I didn't expect you to. Ethan explained everything. The anonymous phone call. The shell companies. The hidden stock purchases. The suspicious ownership structure. Jack listened carefully. When Ethan finished, Jack remained silent for several seconds. Finally he asked, What does this have to do with me? I think. Ethan chose his words carefully. Someone is using you to distract the board. Jack leaned back. So while everyone's looking at me, they're looking away from something else. Exactly. Jack nodded slowly. That actually makes sense. Ethan smiled. You aren't surprised. Jack chuckled. When you've spent 40 years on construction sites, you learn something. What's that? If somebody keeps pointing at one crack in the wall, check the foundation. Ethan laughed. My dad used to say something similar. The Jack smiled. He sounds like he was a smart man. He was. The 2 men sat quietly for a moment. Then Ethan looked Jack directly in the eyes. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. If this gets worse. If the board forces Mom to choose, what are you going to do? Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the photograph of Linda resting on the windowsill. Then back at Ethan. I'm going to do whatever gives your mother the best chance at keeping everything she spent her life building. Ethan sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. Jack smiled. I figured. Evening, Olivia stood outside her mother's office. The door was slightly open. Inside, Victoria sat alone looking through old family photographs. Olivia knocked softly. Mom. Victoria looked up and smiled. Come in. Olivia stepped inside carrying a small envelope. I have something. What is it? She handed it over. Victoria opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. I wasn't brave enough to say it out loud. Victoria unfolded the page. She began reading. For Jack, I judged you before I knew you. I believed rumors because they matched the story I'd already created in my mind. I thought protecting my mother meant protecting her from you. Now I realize she never needed protection from you. She needed protection from people willing to use both of you for their own purposes. I'm sorry. But I want to expect forgiveness. or the truth to come from me instead of someone else. Ugh. Olivia looked up with tears in her eyes. This is beautiful. Olivia shook her head. It's late. It's honest. Victoria folded the letter carefully. Have you given it to him? No. I'm scared. Victoria smiled gently. So is he. Olivia looked surprised. He is. Jack worries every day that loving me might cost me this company. Olivia looked down. He'd really walk away. Wes. Victoria answered without hesitation. Haywood. Olivia closed her eyes. Somehow, knowing that hurt even more. Because it meant every terrible thing she'd believed about him had been wrong. At nearly the same moment, Greg Lawson received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end sounded irritated. The board isn't moving fast enough. Greg walked toward the window. They will. When? Soon. We're running out of opportunities. Greg smiled coldly. No. We're creating them. The caller lowered his voice. What if Ethan finds us? Greg looked down at the city lights. He won't. He already knows about Raven Capital. The Greg's smile disappeared. What? He requested shareholder records. Silence. Long enough for the caller to become nervous. Finally Greg spoke. Then, the timeline changes. What do you want me to do? Greg's answer came without hesitation. Move up phase 2. He ended the call. For the first time since his plan had begun, Greg felt something he hadn't expected. Pressure. Because Ethan Bennett had started asking the right questions. And if Ethan uncovered the truth before the board voted, years of planning could collapse overnight. Tuesday morning, Ethan Bennett arrived at the office before sunrise. The executive floor was almost empty. Only the cleaning crew moved quietly through the hallways. He liked it that way. There were fewer interruptions, fewer questions, and fewer chances for anyone to notice what he was investigating. Melissa entered carrying 2 coffees. You've been here an hour already. I couldn't sleep. She handed him a mug. I found something else. Ethan looked up immediately. What? She placed a thin folder on his desk. It isn't about Raven Capital. It's about Greg. Ethan opened the folder. Inside were expense reports, travel reimbursements, meeting schedules. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then one entry caught his eye. 3 years earlier, Greg had attended an investment strategy conference in Chicago. The company had paid for the trip. Only, the conference had been cancelled 2 months before it was supposed to take place. Ethan frowned. That's strange. Melissa nodded. I checked. He still flew there, and stayed for 2 nights. No conference. No client meetings. No board members. So why was he there? Melissa slid one more page across the desk. A parking receipt. Ethan looked confused. It's from a private office building. The same building. Melissa smiled. The same building where Raven Capital first registered. For the first time, Greg Lawson wasn't just connected by rumors. There was a documented link. Small. Circumstantial. But real. Ethan leaned back. We're getting closer. Jack was replacing the roof on an elderly couple's storage shed when his phone vibrated. Victoria. He climbed carefully down the ladder before answering. Good morning. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are. She laughed nervously. Really? I'm interrupting putting shingles on straight. That sounds serious. It is. If I get distracted, poor Mr. Wilson gets a leaky roof. She smiled. I'll keep this short. Jack could hear the strain in her voice. What's wrong? The board scheduled the confidence vote. His smile disappeared. When? Friday. 3 days. Only 3 days remained. Jack looked toward the partly finished roof. I see. They haven't announced it publicly, but everyone knows. Jack was quiet. Finally he asked, how are you holding up? I've had easier weeks. I imagine. There was a long silence. Then Victoria asked the question she'd been avoiding. If they force me out, will you blame yourself? Jack answered immediately. Yes. You shouldn't. I know. But I will. At lunch, Olivia walked into the Jefferson Community Center carrying the apology letter she'd rewritten 4 times. She had almost turned around twice. Instead, she kept walking. Miguel spotted her first. Can I help you? I'm looking for Jack. Miguel smiled politely. Roof behind the gym. She thanked him and walked outside. Jack was sitting on the tailgate of his pickup eating a sandwich. He stood as she approached. Olivia. Hi. She suddenly forgot every sentence she'd practiced. Jack saved her. You hungry? She blinked. What? I've got an extra sandwich. No, thank you. He sat back down. She remained standing. Finally, she held out the envelope. This is for you. Jack accepted it. He looked at the handwriting. Should I read it now? If you want. If you don't. I understand. Jack carefully opened the envelope. Olivia watched his face as he read. Every second felt like a minute. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and slipped it back inside. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Olivia whispered, I'm sorry. I was cruel. I assumed the worst. I embarrassed you. I accused you of things that weren't true. Tears gathered in her eyes. I don't expect you to forgive me. Jack looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled gently. I already did. She stared at him. You. What? I forgave you weeks ago. Before I apologized. You didn't owe me an apology to deserve forgiveness. Olivia felt tears spill down her cheeks. Why? Jack looked toward the basketball court where children were playing. Because grief makes people protective. I've lived with grief. I recognized yours. She covered her face with one hand. I don't deserve that. Jack chuckled softly. None of us deserves grace. That's why it matters. Olivia laughed through her tears. My dad would have liked you. Jack looked down for a moment. I wish I'd met him. So do I. For the first time, they stood together without suspicion. Not as enemies. Not even as friends. Simply as two people who had loved the same woman in different ways. One as a daughter. The other as the man hoping to spend the rest of his life beside her. That afternoon, Ethan requested copies of Bennett Manufacturing's archived board minutes. The records manager looked surprised. You want meetings from 4 years ago? Yes. All of them. She returned 20 minutes later with 3 storage boxes. Ethan spent the next several hours reading. Most meetings were routine. Budgets, expansion plans, factory maintenance. Then, one meeting transcript stopped him. 4 years earlier, David Bennett had personally proposed tighter oversight of outside investment firms purchasing company stock. The proposal had failed. The vote had been close. Ethan checked the names. Greg Lawson had argued against it. His reasoning seemed ordinary. It would create unnecessary administrative costs. At the time, no one questioned him. Now, Ethan read the transcript again. And again. His father had seen the danger years before. Greg had stopped safeguards from being implemented, not proof. But another piece. Another thread. Another coincidence that wasn't beginning to feel like coincidence anymore. Late that evening, Greg Lawson entered an underground parking garage beneath an office tower across town. A black sedan was already waiting. He climbed into the passenger seat. The driver never looked at him. The vote is Friday. I know. They're hesitating. They won't by then. The driver handed Greg a sealed envelope. What's this? Insurance. Greg opened it. Inside were several photographs. Not of Jack. Not of Victoria. Of Ethan. Leaving the legal archives. Meeting Melissa. Visiting Jack's house. Greg's jaw tightened. Someone's following him. They've been following everyone. Greg looked through the remaining photographs. One image showed Ethan leaving the office building that housed Harrison and Bell Legal Services. He frowned. He's getting too close. The driver spoke quietly. What do you want done? Greg stared through the windshield. For nearly a minute he said nothing. Finally, he placed the photographs back inside the envelope. No violence. The driver nodded. Understood. We're businessmen. We solve problems with leverage. Greg looked toward the concrete wall ahead. Tomorrow morning. Someone will leak a story. What story? Greg smiled without humor. That Ethan Bennett is using company resources to conduct a personal investigation. He'll spend the rest of the week defending himself. And while everyone watches the CEO's son, no one notices who's really stealing the company. The sedan's engine started. As it disappeared into the night, Greg allowed himself a rare feeling of confidence. He believed he was finally back in control. He didn't know that, at that exact moment, Melissa was forwarding one last document to Ethan's personal email. A document she had almost overlooked. It wasn't a financial record or a shareholder filing. It was a visitor log, 3 years old. One signature, one date, one name. A Greg Lawson, a Gafles destination visited Raven Capital Holdings, Suite 8014. It's not a shell company, not a legal office. The actual Raven Capital office itself. For the first time, Ethan wasn't holding another clue. He was holding evidence. Ethan Bennett barely slept. The visitor log sat on his kitchen table beside an untouched cup of coffee. He had read the single page at least 20 times. Visitor, Greg Lawson's Quarters Destinations, Raven Capital Holdings, Suite 84 Second 6 date 3 years earlier. Unlike rumors, unlike anonymous letters, unlike suspicious patterns, this document placed Greg inside Raven Capital's office. Personally, physically. There was no explaining it away as coincidence. Still, Ethan knew one document wasn't enough. Not yet. If he accused Greg without airtight proof, the board would dismiss him as a son trying to protect his mother. He needed more, much more. At 8 o'clock, Melissa knocked on his office door. "You look awful." "I'll take that as a compliment." She smiled. "You've been thinking all night." "I have." He slid the visitor log toward her. "I think this changes everything." Melissa nodded. "It changes the questions, not the answers." Ethan looked out the window. If Greg admits he visited Raven Capital, he'll say it was ordinary business. If he denies it, we have proof he lied. Melissa crossed her arms. "So what do we do?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "We don't confront him." She looked surprised. "We'll keep digging. People like Greg don't leave only one footprint." Across town, Victoria walked into another board meeting. The atmosphere felt different. Not friendlier, colder. Conversations stopped as she entered. Several directors avoided eye contact. Others offered sympathetic smiles. Richard Coleman motioned toward the empty chair beside him. "Good morning." Victoria nodded politely. "It doesn't feel like one." Richard sighed. "I wish things were different." "So do I." Before anyone else arrived, he lowered his voice. "I want you to know, I'm still undecided." Victoria studied his face. "You believe the rumors?" "No." "You believe Jack is dishonest?" "No." "Then what are you undecided about?" Richard looked exhausted. "I'm trying to decide whether protecting one person might endanger thousands of employees." Victoria understood. That was the real fear. Not Jack, not romance. Responsibility. She placed a hand gently on Richard's arm. "If we start sacrificing innocent people because we're afraid, who will protect the next innocent person?" Richard had no answer. Jack spent the morning repairing storm damage at the Jefferson Community Center. Several volunteers joined him. Tyler carried lumber. Miguel handled wiring. Even a few teenagers from the neighborhood showed up after school. By noon, laughter echoed across the playground. Jack climbed down from a ladder and looked around. "You know, I never asked any of you to come." Miguel shrugged. "You didn't have to." Tyler grinned. "You've helped everybody else. It's our turn." Jack smiled. "I'll have to feed all of you." Miguel laughed. "You finally admitted payment exists." Before Jack could answer, Karen's car pulled into the parking lot. Jack frowned. Karen rarely left the office during the workday. She stepped out holding a small envelope. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Jack climbed down from the scaffolding. "Everything okay?" She handed him the envelope. It was delivered anonymously. "To Victoria?" "Yes. She asked me to show you before she did." Jack opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It showed him hugging Victoria outside his house. Across the bottom someone had typed, "Love is expensive. Ask Bennett Manufacturing's employees how much." Jack looked up slowly. "They're getting desperate." Karen nodded. "They're getting cruel." Jack folded the photograph carefully. "How's Victoria?" Karen hesitated. "She's stronger than she looks." Jack smiled sadly. "She usually is." That afternoon, Olivia walked into her mother's office carrying lunch. Victoria looked surprised. "You brought food." "I figured you'd forget." "I was planning to eat." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "Coffee isn't lunch." Victoria laughed. I've been caught. They sat together on the office sofa. For several minutes neither mentioned the board, or Greg, or Jack. Instead they talked about ordinary things, the kind of conversations they'd almost forgotten how to have. Halfway through lunch, Olivia quietly asked, "Do you love him?" Victoria didn't hesitate. "Yes." Olivia smiled softly. "I know." Victoria looked surprised. "When did you know?" "The day he forgave me." She looked down at her sandwich. "I kept waiting for him to prove me right. He never did." Victoria reached across and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Thank you." Olivia shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. I'm still angry." At Greg. Victoria's expression changed. "So am I." Late that afternoon, Ethan visited the building where Raven Capital had once occupied Suite 8014. The receptionist looked confused. "Raven Capital. They moved almost a year ago." "I know. I'm looking for historical leasing records." She hesitated. "I'm not sure we can release those." Ethan handed over his business card. "I'm not asking for confidential financial information. I only need to confirm who leased Suite 8040. The receptionist disappeared into the back office. 10 minutes later she returned with an elderly building manager. "You said you're looking into Suite 8042. "Yes." The manager adjusted his glasses. "I remember that office." "You do?" "Oh, sure. They paid well. But they never stayed long." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Do you remember who visited?" The man chuckled. "Not everybody. But one fellow came often." "What did he look like?" "Tall. Grey hair. Expensive suits. Always polite." Holden reached into his folder and removed a photograph of Greg Lawson. The manager looked at it for barely 2 seconds. "That's him. He came in all the time." Ethan tried to remain calm. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" The manager nodded. "If it's for the truth, yes." For the first time, Ethan had something stronger than paperwork. He had a witness. Meanwhile, Greg Lawson stood alone inside his office. His phone buzzed. "What is it?" The voice on the other end sounded anxious. "The visitor log." Greg froze. "What about it?" "We couldn't recover it." His expression hardened. "Who has it?" "We believe Ethan Bennett." Greg slowly sat down. "When did this happen?" "Yesterday." Silence. A dangerous silence. Finally Greg spoke. "Then we've run out of time. What do we do?" Greg stared out at the city. "Advance everything." "The vote." "Tomorrow morning." "The board wasn't scheduled until Friday." "It is now." The caller hesitated. "They'll ask why." Greg smiled coldly. "They won't. They'll be told new information has come to light." He ended the call. Then he opened a locked drawer in his desk. Inside rested a thick folder labeled Simply's Acquisition Strategy. He looked at it for several seconds before closing the drawer again. Tomorrow, if everything worked, Victoria Bennett would no longer be CEO. The company would fall into chaos, and Raven Capital would quietly begin buying what remained. Just before sunset, Ethan hurried into his mother's office without knocking. Victoria immediately stood. "Ethan." He closed the door behind him. "I know why this is happening." She frowned. "What do you mean?" "It was never about Jack." "I know." "No." He laid the visitor log, witness statement, and corporate filings across her desk. "I can prove it." Victoria looked from one document to another, then slowly up at her son. "Ethan, what are these?" He took a deep breath. "They're the beginning. The beginning of proving that someone inside this company has been working with Raven Capital for years." Victoria's eyes widened. "You think it's Greg?" "I don't think." He pointed to the visitor log. "I know he met them." He pointed to the witness statement. "I know he visited repeatedly." He pointed to the shareholder records. "And I know every rumor about Jack appeared just as Raven Capital increased its ownership." Victoria sat down slowly. For the first time in weeks, the pieces finally fit together. Jack wasn't the target, he was the distraction. Greg hadn't wanted to destroy a relationship. He had wanted to steal a company. At that exact moment, Karen's phone rang from the reception desk outside. She answered. Her face drained of color. She immediately walked into Victoria's office. "The board just called." Victoria looked up. "The vote has been moved." "Win?" Karen swallowed hard. They're assembling. In 1 hour. For one long second, no one moved. Victoria looked at Karen. Karen looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the documents spread across the desk. 1 hour. After weeks of rumors, months of planning, the future of Bennett Manufacturing would be decided in 1 hour. Victoria stood first. Karen. Call Richard Coleman. Karen nodded immediately. Tell him I'm bringing new evidence. What if he refuses? Victoria picked up the visitor log. He won't. If Richard still believes in fairness, he'll listen. 20 minutes later, the executive boardroom filled faster than anyone expected. The mood was different, not tense, uneasy. Almost everyone sensed the meeting had been moved for a reason. Richard Coleman noticed Victoria enter carrying a thick binder. Behind her walked Ethan, Karen, and Melissa. Greg Lawson smiled politely. I wasn't aware guests were invited. Victoria took her seat. They aren't. They're witnesses. Greg's smile barely changed. To what? Victoria didn't answer. Instead, she slid a copy of the visitor log to every board member. Richard adjusted his glasses. Margaret leaned forward. Daniel frowned. Greg remained perfectly still. Richard looked up. What is this? Ethan answered. A certified visitor log from the building that housed Raven Capital Holdings. Silence. Greg finally chuckled. I fail to see the relevance. Ethan looked directly at him. You visited Raven Capital 3 years ago. Several directors looked toward Greg. He shrugged calmly. So? I've visited hundreds of companies. What's unusual about that? Ethan nodded. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Greg's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Ethan continued. So you're confirming this signature is yours? Greg realized the trap a fraction too late. Yes. It appears to be. Ethan smiled. Good. That saves us having to prove it. The room became noticeably quieter. Greg leaned back. I visited an investment company. That's hardly a crime. No, Ethan agreed. It isn't. But failing to disclose repeated meetings with an investment company secretly purchasing Bennett Manufacturing stock while serving as chief financial officer is another matter. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Margaret slowly looked toward Greg. Repeated meetings. Greg answered smoothly. I don't recall repeated meetings. Ethan slid another document across the table. Parking receipts. Visitor records. Calendar entries. One after another. 5 documented visits. Across 18 months. Greg's jaw tightened. Richard looked stunned. Greg, why didn't you disclose this? Greg remained composed. It wasn't relevant. Victoria finally spoke. It became relevant the moment Raven Capital began quietly acquiring our stock. Greg folded his hands. You have circumstantial evidence. Nothing more. I met investors. That's part of my job. Daniel nodded uncertainly. That is true. Greg saw an opening. As CFO, I routinely meet banks, investment firms, auditors, potential partners. If this board wishes to criminalize doing my job, perhaps we're all in the wrong meeting. Several directors exchanged uncertain looks. The momentum shifted, just slightly. Greg noticed. So did Ethan. Melissa quietly stood. I have something. Every head turned. She placed another folder on the table. I prepared shareholder analyses for Ethan. While reviewing filings, I noticed something unusual. She handed copies to the board. Every company purchasing Bennett Manufacturing stock used Harrison and Bell Legal Services. Richard scanned the pages. Margaret frowned. Daniel whispered, every one of them. Melissa nodded. Yes, Greg immediately answered. Large law firms represent hundreds of clients. That's meaningless. Melissa smiled politely. I thought so too, until I looked at the accounting records. She turned another page. The same accounting partner signed filings for 6 supposedly unrelated investment companies. Silence. Richard slowly removed his glasses. This doesn't look independent. No. Melissa agreed. It looks coordinated. Greg's heartbeat quickened. Not outwardly. Years in corporate negotiations had taught him never to show fear. Inside, he was recalculating. The shell companies were supposed to remain invisible. Someone had found the thread. He needed to cut it. Immediately, he looked toward Richard, with respect. This still proves nothing. It proves paperwork. It doesn't prove intent. Victoria stood. No. It proves something else. She walked slowly around the table. For 6 weeks, this board questioned my judgment, my integrity, my leadership. She stopped behind Greg's chair. Not because of facts. Because of fear. She looked around the room, and while every one of us argued about Jack Sullivan, who benefited, nobody answered. She answered herself. Raven Capital. The words landed like a hammer. Richard slowly leaned back. My God. Margaret looked from one document to another. The rumors. Daniel whispered. They kept us distracted. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Greg finally stood. I object. This meeting has become an accusation. Victoria looked at him calmly. No. It has become accountability. Greg picked up his briefcase. If this continues, my attorney will become involved. Richard raised his hand. Sit down. Greg looked at him. I'm sorry, I said. Richard's voice became firmer. Sit down. For the first time in years, Greg hesitated, then slowly returned to his chair. Richard turned toward Ethan. Do you have anything else? Ethan looked at Melissa. She gave a slight nod. He reached into his binder. One final item. He placed a signed statement before every director. This morning, I met with the former building manager where Raven Capital operated. He identified Greg Lawson, Lorsch, as a frequent visitor. The signed witness statement lay in front of every board member. No one spoke. Greg's face remained controlled, but a tiny muscle in his jaw twitched. Margaret noticed, so did Richard. Just then, the conference room door opened. Karen stepped inside. I'm sorry to interrupt. Richard frowned. We're in session. I know, but someone insists on seeing the board. Ooh? Karen looked toward Victoria, then toward Ethan. Finally she answered, a private investigator. Ethan's eyes widened. Frank Dawson. Karen nodded. Yes. He says he has information that couldn't wait. Richard looked around the room. Send him. In. Seconds later, Frank Dawson entered carrying a weathered manila envelope. He nodded respectfully toward the board. I'll keep this brief. He placed the envelope on the table. I was originally hired. He glanced toward Olivia, who had quietly entered with Victoria and was now standing near the back wall, to investigate Jack Sullivan. Olivia lowered her eyes. Frank continued, I found nothing dishonest. But while verifying anonymous accusations, I discovered where some of them came from. He opened the envelope. Inside were printed email records, payment receipts, and a signed invoice. Richard frowned. What are these? Frank answered quietly. Payments, made to fabricate anonymous reports. Every director leaned forward. Frank slid the final page into the center of the table. At the bottom, above are signatures. One name. Gregory Lawson, says no one breathed. Greg stared at the page. For the first time since this nightmare began, he had no explanation ready. The silence stretched across the room. Then Richard Coleman slowly looked up. His voice was barely above a whisper. Greg? Tell me this isn't your signature? The boardroom fell completely silent. No one reached for the papers. No one looked away. Every pair of eyes rested on Greg Lawson. Richard Coleman's question still hung in the air. Greg, tell me this isn't your signature. Greg looked at the invoice for several long seconds. Then he did something Ethan had never seen him do. He smiled, not politely, not confidently, almost resigned. He slowly leaned back in his chair. I was wondering when someone would find that. The room seemed to freeze. Margaret blinked. What? Greg folded his hands calmly. You all seem surprised. Victoria stared at him. Are you admitting it's yours? Greg looked directly at her. Yes, Olivia gasped softly. Daniel Brooks pushed his chair. Wreck. What have you done? Greg looked around the table. What I believed was necessary. Richard's voice hardened. You paid someone to fabricate reports. I paid someone to encourage questions. You lied. I managed perception. Victoria shook her head. You destroyed people's lives. Greg gave a small shrug. No. I used people. There's a difference. The words landed with horrifying indifference. For the first time, everyone in the room saw the real Greg Lawson. Richard stood slowly. I've known you for 21 years. I trusted you. Greg nodded. I know. Why? Greg looked around the room. You really don't understand. No. You built an extraordinary company. He looked at Victoria. Your father was a visionary. So was David. He smiled faintly. And then, you stopped growing. Victoria frowned. We expanded into 3 new states. You played it safe. We protected our employees. You protected inefficiency. Greg stood. His voice remained remarkably calm. The market changed. Manufacturing changed. Investment changed. But Bennett Manufacturing kept behaving like it was still 1995. Richard interrupted him. So your solution was to steal it? Greg looked offended. I wasn't stealing it. I was saving it. Ethan couldn't believe what he was hearing. By destroying our family. Greg looked at him. Families confuse business. I don't. Frank Dawson quietly spoke from the back of the room. You've convinced yourself of that. Greg glanced toward him. You weren't hired to analyze me. No, Frank agreed. But I spent weeks following your trail. He stepped closer. Do you know what surprised me? Greg remained silent. You never once talked about people. You talked about assets, leverage, market position, control. Frank shook his head. You stopped seeing human beings a long time ago. For the first time, Greg looked irritated. I don't need psychological evaluations. No. Frank replied quietly. You need accountability. Victoria slowly walked toward the large windows overlooking Ravenwood. She remembered her father standing there years ago, looking over the factories, talking about responsibility, not profits. People. She turned back toward Greg. You know what David used to tell me? Greg didn't answer. He said, a company isn't the buildings. It isn't the machinery. It isn't even the products. It's the people who trust you enough to spend their lives building something together. She looked directly into Greg's eyes. You forgot that. Greg answered quietly. Nup. I rejected it. The room became still again. Victoria nodded slowly. Thank you. Greg looked confused. For what? For finally telling the truth. Ethan stepped forward carrying another folder. I have one more item. Richard sighed. I don't think we need much more. You do. Ethan placed the folder on the table. This morning, our legal department confirmed something. He opened the folder. Harrison and Bell wasn't simply representing Raven Capital. They represented companies secretly purchasing Bennett Manufacturing shares. Margaret looked up. We know that. Ethan nodded. What we didn't know is who authorized Bennett Manufacturing to share confidential financial forecasts with Harrison and Bell. Silence. He turned another page. A signed authorization form. Only one executive had approved it. Greg Lawson. Victoria's expression hardened. You gave outside investors access to confidential forecasts. Greg didn't deny it. They paid for accurate projections. Richard looked horrified. You leaked company information. I shared strategic guidance. You sold company secrets. I accelerated investment. Daniel slammed his hand on the table. Enough! The sudden outburst echoed across the room. Daniel rarely raised his voice. Today everyone understood why. You swore to protect this company. Greg answered calmly. I protected its future. You protected yourself. Daniel shook his head. I don't even recognize you. Karen quietly entered the room once more. Victoria. She looked apologetic. The employees. They've started gathering downstairs. Victoria frowned. What do you mean? They heard rumors. They know the board is meeting. Nobody's working. No waiting. Richard looked toward the windows. From the executive floor, hundreds of employees could be seen standing outside the main entrance. Factory workers, office staff, maintenance crews, receptionists, engineers, people from every department. Nobody shouted, nobody protested. They simply waited, wondering whether they would still have jobs by the end of the day. Victoria looked at Richard. This is who we're actually responsible for. Richard nodded slowly. You're right. He stood. As chairman, I'm calling for 2 votes. Every director straightened. The first, he looked directly at Greg. Immediate termination of Gregory Lawson for breach of fiduciary duty. Greg remained expressionless. Richard raised his own hand. All in favor. Margaret raised hers. Daniel, Susan, Michael. One after another, every hand rose. Even the two directors Greg believed supported him. Richard looked around the room. The motion passes unanimously. No one celebrated. Greg quietly closed his briefcase. So, it's over. Richard shook his head. No, it's just beginning. He pressed the intercom. Security. Within moments, 2 security officers entered. Greg stood before they reached him. There's no need. He removed his company identification badge, then his executive access card. Finally, he placed both on the conference table. I'll leave with what's still mine. Without another word, he walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he stopped. He looked at Victoria. You were lucky. Victoria answered softly. No, I was loved. Greg looked briefly toward Ethan, then toward Olivia, then finally toward Jack, who had quietly entered the boardroom moments earlier after Karen called him upstairs. Jack hadn't spoken. He had simply stood near the back wall, supporting Victoria by being present. Greg studied him for a moment, then gave a faint, humorless smile. I underestimated you. Jack shook his head. No. You underestimated decency. Greg said nothing else. He walked out. The door closed behind him. No one in the room spoke for several long seconds. Finally, Richard looked toward Victoria. There is one final matter before this board. Victoria already knew. The vote. Richard nodded. Yes. He looked around the table. A vote of confidence. He smiled sadly. I believe been asking the wrong question. He picked up the original ballot. Slowly, he tore it in half, then into quarters, then dropped the pieces into the wastebasket. There will be no vote. Margaret smiled through tears. Agreed. Daniel nodded. Agreed. Every director voiced the same answer. One after another. Unanimous. Victoria Bennett would remain CEO, not because she had survived the rumors, but because she had refused to surrender to them. As relief spread across the room, Karen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then looked up with a smile. The employees just received the announcement. Outside the windows, applause erupted. It rolled through the courtyard like thunder. Hundreds of people, clapping, not for a victory over Greg, but for the leader who had never stopped believing in them. Victoria turned toward Jack. She smiled through tears. We're almost home. Jack gently took her hand. I know. Neither of them realized. Someone was quietly recording the applause on a cell phone. By sunset, the video would spread across Ravenwood. And Olivia Bennett would decide there was one thing left she needed to do before this story could truly end. By sunset, the video had spread across Ravenwood. Someone had recorded the employees applauding outside Bennett Manufacturing. It wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, no music, just hundreds of ordinary people standing together, clapping as Victoria Bennett walked out of the building with Ethan at her side. Comments began appearing within minutes. Shh. That's the kind of CEO people stay late for. Shh. I worked there for 12 years. She knows everyone's name. Sif. Glad the truth finally came out. Sif. Looks like good people won. So Victoria barely glanced at the video. She was exhausted. The past 6 weeks had felt like 6 years. She wanted only one thing: peace. The following morning, Jack arrived at the community center before sunrise. Old habits died hard. He unlocked the storage shed and began organizing lumber for the next volunteer project. The quiet lasted less than 10 minutes. A familiar voice called from behind him. Morning. Jack turned. Olivia stood beside her car. She wasn't wearing business clothes. Instead, she wore jeans, work boots, and a faded Bennett Manufacturing volunteer T-shirt. Jack smiled. That's a surprise. It surprised me too. She walked over carrying a pair of work gloves. I was wondering. She hesitated. If you could use another volunteer. Jack looked around dramatically. I don't know. We've got some pretty high standards. Olivia laughed. I deserve that. Jack grinned. I'm kidding. He handed her a hammer. Ever built a picnic table? No. Perfect. Neither had I the first time. For the next 3 hours, neither of them talked much. They measured, cut boards, carried lumber, made mistakes, started over. At one point Olivia drove a nail so crooked that Jack burst out laughing. That bad? He held up the board. I've seen straighter lightning. She laughed so hard she nearly dropped the hammer. By lunchtime, the picnic table stood solidly in place. Not perfect, but sturdy. Jack brushed sawdust from his shirt. There. It'll outlast both of us. Olivia looked at the finished table. My dad used to say something similar. What was that? If people are still using something you built after you're gone, you lived well. Jack smiled. He was a wise man. She nodded quietly. He was. After a long silence, Olivia reached into her pocket. I have one more thing. She removed a small velvet box. Jack looked confused. What is it? She opened it. Inside rested David Bennett's wedding band. I found it in Mom's dresser. Jack stared at the ring. I can't take that. I'm not asking you to. She closed the box again. It belongs to Mom. Then why show me? Olivia looked toward the lake. Because I needed to make peace with something. Jack waited. When Dad died, I thought loving someone new meant leaving him behind. She smiled sadly. I know now. That's not how love works. Jack nodded gently. No, it isn't. She looked back at him. If Mom decides one day that she's ready, I hope she'll wear this next to a new ring. Jack felt his throat tighten. I don't want to replace your father. I know. You couldn't. She smiled. And you never tried. For the first time, Olivia stepped forward and hugged him. Jack hugged her back like he would his own daughter. Nothing forced. Nothing dramatic. Just forgiveness becoming family. That afternoon, Ethan arrived at Bennett Manufacturing carrying a banker's box. Karen looked up from her desk, cleaning out Greg's office. He nodded. Legal finished their inventory. They said I could sort through anything related to Dad. Karen smiled. He'd like that. Inside Greg's office, the room felt strangely empty. The expensive artwork was gone. The desk had been cleared. Only the shelves remained. Ethan slowly worked through the files. Budgets, contracts, forecasts. Then, a small leather notebook fell from the back of a cabinet. He opened it. Inside weren't financial calculations. There were handwritten notes, meeting reminders, private thoughts. One page stopped him. David Bennett suspects too much. Delay governance proposal. Another page. Need board distracted before acquisition reaches 18% to 6 of another. Find personal leverage. Easier than fighting financials. Ethan closed the notebook slowly. For weeks, he had wanted proof. Now he wished he had never found it. Because every page confirmed the same painful truth. Greg hadn't acted out of desperation. He had planned everything. For years, late that afternoon Victoria visited the cemetery. She came alone. She carried fresh white lilies. David Bennett's headstone overlooked a quiet hillside. She knelt and placed the flowers carefully. Well, she smiled softly. It's been quite a week. The breeze rustled through the trees. I wish you could have met Jack. She laughed quietly. You would have argued about baseball. And old pickup trucks. And who made better coffee. Her smile faded into something more thoughtful. I think you would have liked him. She looked down at the wedding ring still resting on her hand. I've kept this on because I wasn't ready. She traced it gently with her thumb. Not because I was holding on to you. She looked toward the sky. But because I wasn't ready to begin again. A tear slipped down her cheek. I think I am now. She kissed her fingertips, touched the top of David's headstone, and stood. As she walked back toward her car, she didn't look back. Not because she had forgotten. Because she no longer needed to say goodbye. That evening, Jack invited everyone to dinner at his house. Nothing fancy. Grilled chicken, corn on the cob, potato salad. Miguel claimed responsibility for dessert. Everyone immediately became suspicious. You don't trust my cooking? Miguel asked. Tyler laughed. We trust your intentions. It's your recipes that scare us. The backyard filled with laughter. Karen came. Frank Dawson stopped by for an hour. Several volunteers from the community center joined them. For the first time in months, no one talked about board meetings, or rumors, or Raven Capital. Instead, they talked about fishing, baseball, favorite movies, bad bosses, Embarrassing childhood stories. Life slowly returned to normal. As the sun began to set, Ethan quietly stepped beside Jack near the grill. I wanted to thank you. Jack looked puzzled. For what? For reminding us what kind of family we're supposed to be. Jack smiled. I didn't do that. You did. Ethan shook his head. We were so busy protecting Mom that we stopped protecting each other. Jack looked across the yard. Victoria and Olivia were laughing together. Karen was helping Miguel rescue a slightly burned pie. Frank was pretending not to enjoy himself. Children chased each other across the lawn. Jack smiled. Looks to me like your family's doing just fine. Ethan nodded. It is now. Just then, Victoria walked over carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed one to Jack. Can I borrow you for a minute? Of course. They walked toward the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Victoria reached into her purse. She held out a small velvet box. Jack recognized it immediately. The ring. She nodded. David's. Jack looked at it quietly. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. She smiled warmly. Just understand what it means. She opened the box. The wedding band rested inside. I'll always love the man who gave me this. She closed the lid. And I'll always be grateful for the life we shared. Then, she looked into Jack's eyes. But my future isn't behind me anymore. She slipped the box back into her purse. When you're ready, I'd like us to choose a ring together. Jack couldn't speak. He simply took her hand. Some answers didn't need words. As they stood beneath the old oak tree, watching the people they loved fill the backyard with laughter, neither noticed Olivia quietly wiping away happy tears. Tomorrow, there would be one final chapter. Not about surviving, but about beginning again. 6 months later, spring had returned to Ravenwood. The trees surrounding Jefferson Community Center were covered in fresh green leaves. Flowers lined the walking paths. Children laughed on the basketball court Jack had rebuilt. It was the kind of Saturday that reminded people why they loved living there. Jack stood near the entrance wearing a navy blue suit that Miguel had insisted he buy. Jack adjusted the tie for what felt like the 100th time. I look ridiculous. Miguel rolled his eyes. You look nervous. I am nervous. Good. You should be. Jack frowned. That's supposed to help? Miguel laughed. If you weren't nervous, Ford, I'd be worried. Tyler walked over carrying a small wooden box. I've got the rings. Jack smiled. Please don't lose them. Tyler looked offended. I've only lost important things twice. Jack blinked. Twice. Miguel quickly interrupted. We're changing the subject. The 3 men laughed together. For the first time in a very long time, Jack wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about the future. Inside the community center, Victoria stood with Olivia and Karen. Her wedding dress was elegant without being extravagant. Simple ivory fabric. Long sleeves. A small bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers she had taken to David's grave months earlier. Olivia adjusted her mother's veil. You look beautiful. Victoria smiled. So do you. Olivia laughed. I'm not the one getting married. No. But today feels like a beginning for both of us. Olivia nodded. It does. Karen stepped closer. Ready? Victoria took a slow breath. I've waited a long time to answer that question. She smiled. Yes. I'm ready. Guests slowly filled the chairs set beneath the large oak trees. There were no celebrities, no reporters, no extravagant decorations. Just people. Construction workers, factory employees, neighbors, teachers, volunteers, people whose lives had crossed Jack's and Victoria's over the years. Frank Dawson sat beside Richard Coleman. Margaret Ellis chatted with Mrs. Helen Brooks. Daniel Brooks laughed with Miguel over one of his stories. Near the front sat Ethan. Beside him, an empty chair remained. A small framed photograph rested on it. David Bennett. Victoria had insisted on it, not because she couldn't move forward, but because the man who had shared so much of her life would always be part of her family's story. On another small table rested a photograph of Linda Sullivan. 2 lives remembered. 2 lives honored. Not replaced. Never forgotten. Simply carried forward with love. Soft piano music began. To play. Everyone stood. Jack looked toward the path. Victoria appeared beneath the flowering trees. For a moment, the world seemed to disappear. She smiled. Jack smiled back. Neither noticed anyone else. Olivia gently squeezed her mother's hand. "You've got this." Victoria whispered, "We've got this." Together they walked forward. Halfway down the aisle, Victoria looked toward the photographs. She smiled softly. "Thank you." Then she continued toward Jack. The ceremony was led by Pastor Samuel Reed, who had known both families for years. He smiled warmly. "We're here today, not because two people needed someone to complete them, but because two whole people found the courage to begin again." Several guests quietly wiped away tears. The pastor looked toward Jack. "Do you have vows?" Jack nodded. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. His hands shook slightly. "I've built houses. I've repaired schools. I've fixed broken roofs." He smiled nervously. "But I've never been very good with speeches." Laughter rippled through the guests. Jack looked at Victoria. "When Linda became sick, I thought the happiest years of my life were behind me. After she was gone, I convinced myself that was simply how life worked." He took a slow breath. "Then I met a woman who smiled at a charity galas, and somehow made an old construction worker believe tomorrow could still surprise him." Victoria laughed through tears. Jack continued, "I can't promise perfect days. I can't promise we won't disagree. I can't promise life won't surprise us again. But I can promise this. I will choose you. Tomorrow. The day after. And every day we're given. As long as we're given it." He folded the paper. "I love you." Victoria reached for his hands, then unfolded her own vows. "When David died, I thought loving again would mean loving him less." She glanced toward David's photograph. "I finally learned that love doesn't divide. It grows." She looked back at Jack. "You never asked me to forget my past. You honored it. You respected it. You made room for it." Her voice trembled. "And because you did, you made room for our future too." She smiled. "I choose you. Not because I need rescuing. Not because I'm lonely. But because life is better when I get to walk through it beside you. I love you." There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. The pastor smiled. "The rings." Tyler stepped forward. To everyone's relief, he still had them. Miguel whispered loudly, "I told you not to lose them." Tyler whispered back, "I didn't." Several guests laughed. The small moment eased everyone's emotions. Jack carefully placed the ring on Victoria's finger. Victoria placed Jack's ring on his. The pastor looked at them both. "By the authority entrusted to me, it is my great honor to pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Jack smiled. "So, is now a good time?" Victoria laughed. "I've been waiting all morning." They kissed. The applause began instantly. Not loud, not dramatic, warm, joyful, real. The reception was held right there at the community center. Children played basketball. Neighbors danced. Miguel somehow convinced Richard Coleman to try line dancing. Richard immediately regretted it. Karen laughed harder than anyone had ever seen. Frank quietly slipped away before one could ask him to dance. Mrs. Helen Brooks insisted everyone take home homemade cookies. Even the weather seemed determined to cooperate, as evening settled over Ravenwood. Jack and Victoria walked together toward the picnic table that he and Olivia had built months earlier. They sat side by side, listening to laughter drift across the park. Victoria leaned against his shoulder. "You know, this place changed my life." Jack smiled. "It changed mine too." She looked around. "The funny thing is, I thought I was coming here to help rebuild a community center. What actually happened was someone rebuilt me." Jack gently squeezed her hand. "You rebuilt yourself. I just happened to be nearby." She smiled, still humble. "I've had practice." They laughed together. After a quiet moment, Olivia and Ethan walked over. Olivia smiled. "We didn't want the day to end without saying something." Jack looked at them. "I'm listening." Olivia took a deep breath. "You once told me, love isn't a room with only one chair." Jack nodded. "I remember." She smiled. "I finally understand. Ethan looked at his mother. Dad would be happy today? Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I believe he would. Ethan looked at Jack. And so are we. Without another word, the four of them embraced, not as people connected by loss, but as a family connected by love. Later that evening, the last guests began heading home. Miguel carried leftover desserts to anyone willing to take them. Tyler loaded folding chairs into a truck. Karen locked the community center doors. Jack and Victoria stood alone beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where they had spoken about their future months earlier. Fireflies danced across the evening air. Jack looked up at the stars. You know, I think Linda would have liked you. Victoria smiled. I think David would have liked you too. Jack nodded. I hope so. Victoria slipped her hand into his. They're pal of our story. They always will be. But tonight, she rested her head on his shoulder. This chapter belongs to us. They stood there quietly. No cameras, no reporters, no board meetings, no rumors, just peace. The kind of peace that can only be earned. The kind that comes after forgiveness, after courage, after choosing hope when fear seems easier. Sometimes people believe the greatest love stories are about finding the perfect person. They aren't. The greatest love stories are about finding someone who reminds you that your life didn't end with your hardest goodbye. Sometimes the most beautiful chapter is the one you never believed you'd get to write. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes it's never too late to find love again. Thank you for spending this journey with us, and we'll see you in the next story.